Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where quiet stories take the long road, strange places get a little closer, and the world always seems slightly bigger by the time the night settles in. Tonight, we're heading into the Appalachian Mountains, into old woods, steep ridges, narrow paths, and the kind of places that look peaceful right up until the moment they do not. Our subject is a simple one on the surface, though it becomes less simple the farther you walk. Why even locals avoid certain trails. Now that does not mean every path in Appalachia is dangerous, cursed, haunted, or waiting dramatically behind a tree with a violin soundtrack. Most are not. Many are beautiful. Some are gentle enough for an afternoon stroll, and some are so well loved they have probably seen more hiking boots than a city pavement. Still, tucked among those ordinary trails are others with a different sort of reputation. These are the ones people mention carefully, the ones older residents describe with a shrug that somehow says more than a lecture, the ones that get recommended against in a tone so casual that you only later realise it was not casual at all. Maybe that is what makes them so interesting. Not loud fear, not a grand warning with thunder in the distance, just that calm local sentence. I wouldn't go up there if I were you. And if you are listening from somewhere far from the Appalachians, perhaps from a city apartment, a quiet town, or a room where the only wilderness nearby is a particularly ambitious houseplant, you might wonder what kind of trail can make the people who grew up around these mountains decide that a certain route is best left alone. Is it wildlife, bad weather, rough terrain, local folklore, human danger, a mix of all of it, bundled together with old memory and passed down so often that it becomes instinct? The answer, as usual, is a little messier than one tidy explanation. Before we follow that trail any farther, I would love to know where you're listening from tonight, and what the landscape around you looks like when the sun goes down. Is it all streetlights and glass, flat farmland, ocean air, another mountain range, or one quiet road with a porch light at the end of it? There is something fitting about gathering here from so many different places to talk about a region that has always made distance feel strange. In the mountains, a place can be only a few miles away and still feel removed from the rest of the world. If this kind of slow wandering through odd history, local warnings, and places that keep their own counsel helps you unwind, do consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps this little corner of calm find more people who enjoy a softer kind of mystery. And if you are already settled in with a blanket, a late cup of tea, or that noble bedtime intention of just one more video, then you are exactly where you need to be. So, let us ease into the hills. The Appalachian Mountains stretch across a great deal of eastern North America, and they are old in a way that is difficult to picture properly. Not just old by human standards, not even old by the standards of castles, ruins, or ancient roads, but old on a scale that makes most things we call old look freshly unpacked. These mountains were already ancient long before there were towns in the hollows, before rail lines, before maps were reliable, before the names now attached to ridges and creeks had settled into common use. They have been worn down by time, softened at the edges, forested over, folded into long green shapes that can look almost gentle from a distance. That gentleness is one of the first tricks they play. Because the Appalachians do not always present themselves like dramatic mountain ranges in postcards. There are no endless fields of bare rock everywhere, no constant display of jagged, icy peaks that announce danger from 50 miles away. Instead, much of the region appears inviting. Tree-covered slopes, shaded paths, soft mist in the mornings, ridges that roll away in layers of blue and grey, streams moving over stone, ferns, moss, birdsong, and enough beauty to convince almost anyone that the place is welcoming. And in many places it is, but in other places that same beauty hides a practical problem. Dense forest can erase perspective, fog can flatten distance, trails can split, fade, bend, reappear, or lead somewhere less helpful than expected. Weather can change with very little concern for your plans. A path that seems clear by daylight can become confusing in half an hour. A slope that looks manageable from below can become exhausting slippery and risky once you're actually on it. The mountains are not evil. They are simply under no obligation to make things easy. Locals know this in a way visitors often do not. That knowledge usually begins early. It comes from family trips, hunting routes, fishing spots, camping stories, seasonal habits, and years of hearing which roads wash out, which creeks rise too fast, which hollows lose daylight early, which ridges get ugly in a storm, and which parts of the woods seem to attract trouble. Not always supernatural trouble, though the stories do not exactly avoid that lane. More often the trouble is ordinary in the way that ordinary things become serious very quickly outdoors. A bad step, a missed turn, a drop in temperature, an injury in a place where help arrives slowly. One bad decision stacked on top of another. A trail that appears simple until it is not. Outsiders sometimes hear local warnings and assume they are exaggerated. This happens in mountain regions all over the world. A traveller sees a worn footpath and thinks, how bad can it be? The answer is often worse than it looks, especially if you have mistaken familiarity for simplicity. People who know the terrain rarely make that mistake. They know that a mountain does not need to be especially high to be dangerous. It only needs to be steep enough, wet enough, isolated enough, or confusing enough at the wrong moment. In Appalachia, certain trails gather that reputation over time. Some are known for injuries, some for disappearances, some for sudden changes in weather or difficult navigation, some for unofficial side paths that tempt hikers away from the marked route, some for cliffs, loose rock, stream crossings, or stretches where rescue is far more difficult than most people realise. Then there are the places that carry another kind of reputation, one built not just from maps and topography, but from stories repeated over generations. A gap in the ridge where people swear things feel wrong after dark, an old roadbed where no one likes to linger, a hollow with too many strange accounts attached to it, a section of woods that locals avoid without needing to produce a PowerPoint presentation. That last category is especially interesting because it sits somewhere between reason and feeling. Human beings are very good at turning patterns into stories. We have always done it. A dangerous place gets a warning attached to it. The warning gets repeated. Over time it grows details. The details become tradition. And tradition, especially in isolated or deeply rooted communities, can shape behaviour very effectively. A child hears that a certain trail is not a place to fool around, and years later, as an adult, that lesson still sits in the back of the mind. Maybe they no longer believe every detail of the original tale. Maybe they never did. But they still do not go there at dusk. They still do not go alone. They still find a reason to choose another trail. That does not make the warning foolish. In fact, folklore often preserves practical caution in a form people remember. It is easier to remember a story than a list of risk factors. Do not go there. Strange things happen, may keep more people safe than the terrain has poor visibility, uneven footing, and a history of disorientation events. One sounds like advice from an old neighbour. The other sounds like a notice attached to a clipboard. And while we are being fair to clipboards, both messages can be useful. Part of the appeal of the Appalachians is that the region still holds on to a certain kind of distance. Not every place is polished for visitors. Not every trail has full signage, cell service, railings, or the comforting sense that someone official is only 5 minutes away. There are stretches of mountain country where the road narrows, the signal fades, and the forest begins to feel less like scenery and more like the main fact of the place. This is not a flaw. In many ways it is the point, but it changes the stakes. A person from elsewhere may see a trailhead and think they are entering a managed outdoor experience. A local may see the same sign and mentally add several invisible footnotes. Watch the weather. Do not trust the distance estimate too much. Stay on the main route. Be careful near the rock face after rain. Do not assume anyone will hear you if you yell. Do not count on your phone. Be off the ridge before dark. And maybe, if you mention one particular side trail, the local pauses and says, "No, not that one." Notice how much of that knowledge is social. It is learned from people. The mountains are read not just through maps, but through conversation. Which trail is worth it? Which one is overrated? Which one is fine in autumn but miserable in spring? Which one attracts reckless visitors? Which one has a history? Which one simply gives people a bad feeling, and not in a theatrical way either? More in the tone of, people have had enough trouble up there that I just leave it be. That is another important piece of this subject. The reputation of certain Appalachian trails is not always built on a single dramatic event. More often it comes from accumulation. One rescue here, one fatal fall there, a few near misses, a handful of odd local stories, reports of people getting lost in an area that looks too small on paper to cause that much confusion, accounts of hunters, hikers, or even seasoned locals saying that a place changed mood too quickly, nothing overwhelming on its own, taken together, enough to make a route feel marked, even if no official sign says so. Mood matters more in the woods than people like to admit, not because the forest is magical every time a leaf moves in the breeze, but because human perception changes in remote places. Sound carries strangely. Light shifts faster than expected. Familiar reference points disappear. A trail can feel entirely normal one minute and unsettling the next for reasons that are not easy to explain in the moment. Sometimes there is a practical cause. The fog thickens. The wind changes direction. Birdsong stops because a predator is nearby. The temperature drops. You realize you have not seen another person for a long time. Your brain notices a pattern before your conscious mind does, and the result is a sense that something is off. Locals often trust that feeling because they have learned to. Visitors sometimes dismiss it because it sounds vague. Yet vagueness is not always useless. Experienced outdoors people develop instincts based on countless little observations. The angle of light, the condition of the ground, the smell of incoming rain, the position of the ridge, the time it will take to get back, the behaviour of water, the way a place feels when conditions are turning against you. Ask them why they chose not to continue, and they may not produce a neat speech, they may just say it did not seem worth it. That phrase, not worth it, appears more often than you might expect in local attitudes toward bad trails. It is not always fear. Sometimes it is simply judgment. There are plenty of places to walk in the Appalachians, plenty of views, streams, woods, bolds, overlooks, and quiet roads. If one trail has a record of trouble, poor maintenance, confusing turns, risky footing, or a pattern of drawing the kind of visitor who treats caution as a personal insult, many locals decide there is no great prize at the end of proving themselves there. Another path will do. The mountain will still be there tomorrow. Pride, they have discovered, is not especially useful on a wet slope. Of course, that very refusal can make a trail more tempting to everyone else. Tell people not to go somewhere, and a certain percentage of the population immediately starts tightening their bootlaces. This is not new. Forbidden places attract attention. The trail with the warning gets more curiosity than the trail with the picnic table and the nice overlook. People want the strange story. They want the hidden place, the local secret, the one route everyone talks around. And sometimes they go in underprepared, because the warning itself feels like part of the adventure. A little mystery, a little danger, a good anecdote for later. Later, unfortunately, is not guaranteed. This is where the Appalachian setting matters so much. The region has beauty, yes, but it also has scale, weather, isolation, and a long habit of resisting simple summaries. One valley is not the next valley. One trail may be manageable while another, only a short drive away, is steep, badly marked, and unpleasantly good at swallowing time. There are places where the tree cover is so dense and the terrain so repetitive that a person can become disoriented faster than expected. There are ravines and creek beds that sound easy until rain turns them into something else. There are old unofficial routes that appear on some maps, disappear on others, and continue to exist mostly because people assume the person before them knew what they were doing. That assumption has led many people into trouble over the years. Following a worn path is not the same as following the correct one. In mountain country, people, animals, runoff, and long habit can create routes that look convincing enough to lure the unwary. A side trail may branch off so neatly that it feels intentional. A shortcut may seem obvious. A less used path might promise a faster way down, a better view, or an easier return. Then the ground changes, the markers vanish, and the quiet becomes much less charming. And the quiet in the Appalachians can be substantial. Not constant silence, because forests are full of life, but a kind of enveloping separation from the rest of the world. No traffic hum, no nearby voices, no helpful cafe with a chalkboard menu and a restroom key attached to a plank. Just woods, slope, weather, and however well you prepared. For some people, that is the appeal. For others, especially those who understand how quickly conditions can shift, it is exactly why caution matters so much. There is also the human side, which should not be ignored just because mountain folklore tends to get better press. Some trails are avoided because they are remote enough to attract activity you would rather not wander into by accident. Illegal camps, hidden grow operations in some areas, unstable abandoned structures, old mine sites, unsafe gathering spots, or simply isolated places where encountering the wrong person at the wrong time becomes a more serious matter because there is no one else around. Locals do not always spell these things out to strangers. Sometimes discretion is part of the warning. Sometimes saying just don't go there is easier, safer, and more likely to be followed. Then again, some places earn their reputation through stories that are far older than any modern hazard. A trail may pass through land associated with old settlements, battle routes, vanished communities, family feuds, burial grounds, missing persons, or events that linger in regional memory even when the exact details have gone soft around the edges. In Appalachia, oral history has a long reach. You do not always need a written sign for a place to come with instructions. All of that means that when locals avoid certain trails, they may be responding to several layers at once. The practical layer, the inherited layer, the emotional layer, the one based on direct experience and the one based on stories told often enough to become part of the place itself. You could walk a trail with a guidebook in hand and still miss half of what local memory knows about it. You could also dismiss local memory entirely and discover, usually at an inconvenient moment, that it was trying to save you trouble. None of this is meant to turn the Appalachians into some grand forbidden zone. That would be unfair to the region and inaccurate besides. People live there, work there, hunt there, hike there, fish there, and love those mountains deeply. They are not avoiding the entire range like it owes them money, but deep familiarity often produces a kind of respect that outsiders mistake for superstition. Respect is quieter than fear. It does not need to perform, it just changes behaviour. And that is where our path begins tonight. Not with a single scary tale, not with a declaration that every local warning hides something supernatural in the fog, and not with the idea that all danger arrives wearing dramatic music. Instead, we begin with a simple observation. In the Appalachian Mountains, certain trails are avoided for reasons that sit at the intersection of land, memory, weather, history, instinct, and plain common sense. Once you start looking closely, each of those reasons opens into the next, and the picture becomes much more interesting than a ghost story told around a campfire, though I admit the campfire version does have its charms. Because to understand why some paths are left alone, we have to begin with the mountains themselves. With what kind of landscape creates this kind of caution in the first place, and why age, terrain, and distance have shaped not only the trails but the people who speak about them the way they do. The first thing to understand about the Appalachian Mountains is that they are old in a way that changes how they behave. That sounds obvious at first. Mountains are made of rock. Rock is old. Fair enough. But the Appalachians are not just old as a collection of hills and ridges. They belong to a much earlier chapter of the Earth's history, formed hundreds of millions of years ago through collisions so massive that the continents themselves were rearranged. Long before the Atlantic Ocean opened between North America and Europe, long before the shapes on our maps began to look familiar, the land that would become the Appalachians was caught up in a sequence of geological collisions, compressions, uplifts, and foldings that pushed enormous masses of stone upward. Later, time got to work on them with great patience and no concern at all for preserving dramatic peaks. That is why these mountains often surprise people. The Rockies look young because, geologically speaking, they are younger. They have that sharp, freshly broken look, all steep profiles and high theatrical confidence. The Appalachians have been worn down over immense stretches of time. Rain, frost, rivers, gravity, roots, and season after season after season have softened them. Their edges have been rounded. Their lines have been lowered. Their steepest cliffs are often hidden behind trees until you are much closer than you expected. From a distance, they can appear almost gentle, like the earth has exhaled and settled into long folds. But age does not make a landscape simple. In many cases, it does the opposite. An older mountain range can become more complicated to move through, because time has had longer to carve it into gullies, ravines, hollows, drainages, shelves, gaps, switchback-worthy slopes, hidden creeks, and ridges that seem to multiply as you travel. The Appalachians do not always declare their structure clearly. Their forests cover so much of the underlying shape that the terrain has to be felt as much as seen. A map may show contour lines, a guidebook may offer a neat description. Yet on the ground, the land keeps presenting one more fold, one more side hollow, one more rise beyond the rise you thought would be the last. This matters because human beings tend to judge difficulty by appearance. If a mountain looks severe, we prepare for severity. If it looks welcoming, we often lower our guard. That can be a mistake in the Appalachians. These mountains rarely need to shout. They have had far too long to refine subtler methods. One of those methods is concealment. Dense tree cover changes everything. It shortens your field of view, blurs distant reference points, and makes the landscape feel smaller than it really is. In open country, you can often understand where you are by looking round. You see the next ridge, the valley, the route back, the weather coming in. In the Appalachians, especially in summer or in thick cove forests, you may see only the next bend, the next stand of hemlocks, the next patch of rhododendron leaning across the trail like it has opinions. The mountains are still there in full, but they stop presenting themselves as a whole. They arrive in pieces. That piece-by-piece quality shapes local experience. A person raised around the Appalachians usually develops a different sense of distance than someone from flatter or more open land. They learn that 2 points which look close on a map may not feel close at all, once the route begins dropping into one drainage and climbing back out of another. They learn that a ridgewalk can be straightforward one day, and unwise the next, depending on rain, wind, fog, or the season. They learn that steepness is only part of the problem. Ground conditions matter. So does leaf cover, so does loose shale, slick roots, blowdown, water crossings. And the simple fact that being turned around in a thick eastern forest can happen faster than most people would like to admit. That kind of knowledge is the beginning of mountain memory. Not mystical memory. Not the mountain whispering legal advice from a mossy boulder. Just accumulated recognition. Patterns noticed, tested, passed along and remembered. A ridge that catches storms, a slope that stays wet, a bend in the creek that floods before people expect it to, a trail that looks clear in winter but disappears into green growth by late spring, a section of woods where sound travels oddly, a route that hunters know, hikers misunderstand, and rescue crews speak about with a kind of tired respect. The longer people live alongside a landscape, the more this memory thickens. In Appalachia, that thickness is hard to separate from daily life. Families have lived in these mountains for generations. Roads follow old passages. Towns sit in valleys shaped by older routes of travel. Cemeteries rest on slopes above creeks. Churches, cabins, logging traces, abandoned grades, mine entrances, old farm walls and forgotten home sites remain scattered through the region. sometimes hidden so well that a person can walk close by and never know. The forest is not empty in the way visitors sometimes imagine. It is full of previous use, human use, animal use, seasonal use, working use. That is another reason locals treat certain trails differently. They are not just hiking routes. Some of them are old corridors through layered ground. A path in the Appalachians may have started as a game trail, later widened by indigenous travel, then adapted by settlers, then reshaped by loggers, then folded into an informal local route, then marked by modern hikers who assumed it had always been meant for recreation. That is a lot of history for one line of dirt, and history leaves practical consequences. Old routes do not always meet modern expectations. They may go straight up a slope because pack animals and people once handled it differently. They may pass close to unstable areas because there was a reason decades ago that no longer applies. They may split in ways that made sense to a farming community, a logging crew, or a hunting tradition, but make very little sense to a weekend visitor with a water bottle and a cheerful level of optimism. This is where the age of the mountains and the memory of the people start to overlap. The land has been shaped over enormous time. The human use of that land has been shaped over smaller but still substantial stretches of time. Put the two together, and you get places that cannot be understood fully from signage alone. Take the simple idea of a hollow, or a cove, or a gap. To someone unfamiliar with Appalachian terrain, these may sound like pleasant geographic details. And often they are, lovely even. Until weather changes, light drops, or a person loses track of where the drainage runs, because the same feature that makes a place beautiful can also make it difficult. Hollows funnel water, gaps channel wind, north-facing slopes keep dampness and cold longer than expected. Dense laurel can tangle movement into something far less graceful than the phrase nature walk might suggest. A lovely forest can become an obstacle course with opinions. Rhododendron and mountain laurel deserve special mention here, partly because they are beautiful, and partly because beauty remains one of the forest's most effective distractions. In bloom, they are almost absurdly attractive. Soft pink, white, pale lavender, whole tunnels of blossoms arching over creeks and trails. Very charming. Very photogenic, also capable, in the right density, of turning whole sections of mountain into a thicket so tangled that locals have long had colourful names for such places, not all of them polite enough for a bedtime channel. These thickets can block sightlines, slow progress, hide drop-offs, and make leaving a trail far easier than re-entering it. A person who steps off to investigate a sound, a view, or a shortcut can suddenly find that the woods no longer agree with the plan. Again, this is not dramatic fiction. It is just how older, heavily vegetated mountains work. They create conditions where getting a little lost can happen in a very ordinary way. That ordinariness is important. People often imagine danger arriving with fanfare. In reality, it usually arrives dressed as routine. Local memory stores those routines well. One person slips near a wet rock ledge, another misses a turn where an old side path branches off. Someone underestimates the time needed to get back before dark. A storm forms faster than expected. A creek crossing that looked manageable in the morning becomes a problem on the return. These are not necessarily legendary events. Many of them never become famous outside the county or the family, or the group of people who still remember the day. But they enter the local understanding of place. A trail becomes that one where folks get turned around. A ridge becomes the place where weather comes over fast. A drainage becomes fine if it's dry, not worth it if it's been raining. With enough repetition, caution becomes culture. And in mountain communities, culture is often transmitted casually. That is one of the reasons outsiders sometimes misread it. The warning may not arrive in a formal speech. No one is likely to sit you down beneath a framed map, dim the lights, and begin a dramatic presentation titled, "Reasons You Should Not Wander Up There." More often the message comes lightly. I'd leave that trail alone. You can go there, but I don't. not after the leaves are down, not in wet weather, not late, not alone. There is tremendous efficiency in those little sentences. They carry years of experience without needing to unpack every incident behind them. Older mountains encourage that kind of speech because they resist neat explanation. The terrain is too varied, and the reasons are too layered. One trail may be avoided because of footing, another because of flooding, another because it passes old mine land that should not be trusted, another because it crosses private property lines in confusing ways, and people would rather not deal with the consequences. Another because it has a history of attracting overconfident visitors who treat warning signs as suggestions from an especially nervous aunt. Another because something bad happened there once, then again, and then enough times that no one feels any need to test the pattern further. When people say the mountains have a long memory, this is usually what they mean in practical terms. Marks remain. Roots persist. Stories attach themselves to terrain. The land holds evidence longer than people expect. A stone foundation deep in the woods may mark a home site from generations back. An old road cut may still guide runoff and erosion long after the wagons are gone. An abandoned railroad grade may look like an easy walk until it carries you confidently in the wrong direction. A family burial plot on a slope may remind locals that the forest has not always been forest in the way visitors imagine. Every one of these details can shape how a trail is perceived. There's also a psychological effect to moving through very old landscapes. People feel it even when they do not describe it well. Newer built environments tend to explain themselves. Streets tell you where to go, signs announce purpose, buildings declare ownership. In the mountains, especially older and less managed sections, purpose becomes less obvious. A path might have several former reasons for existing, all overlapping. A clearing may be natural, or old human use, or utility maintenance, or something else entirely. A creek may seem too precisely placed, a cut too straight, a cluster of daffodils too deliberate. The land gives little hints that people have been here before, but not always enough to explain who, when, or why. That uncertainty makes places feel charged, even when the explanation is probably ordinary and historical rather than eerie. Still, it would be unfair to dismiss the eerie part entirely. Old places gather stories because people keep meeting the limits of their knowledge there. A family knows a route, but not everything that happened along it 50 years before they were born. A hunter knows a ridge but still avoids one side hollow after dusk. A hiker hears that an old cabin once stood off the trail and begins to notice every snapped branch as though it were delivering commentary. Human beings fill gaps with narrative. The Appalachians offer many gaps. Their geology contributes to that too. Folded mountain belts create repeating forms, ridge after ridge, drainage after drainage, wooded slopes that look similar enough to encourage confusion. In poor visibility, sameness is a problem. Not exact sameness, but enough resemblance that orientation begins to slip. This is one reason experienced people rely on more than one cue. They watch the slope, the water flow, the position of the sun when visible, the lay of the ridges, the timing of the walk, and sometimes their own discomfort. A trail can be technically passable and still be a bad choice on a given day. Locals learn that a long memory is not just about remembering where things are. It is about remembering when not to go. That restraint often looks unremarkable from the outside. Someone chooses another path. Someone heads back earlier than expected. Someone passes a side trail without comment. Yet these small acts are built from years of observation. They may also be built from inherited accounts. Grandparents, parents, neighbours, old hunters, volunteer firefighters, game wardens, rescue workers, park staff, road crews. In mountain regions, all of these people contribute to the unwritten map. The official map shows trails and contour lines. The unwritten map shows reputation, and reputation, once established, is remarkably durable in a place like Appalachia. The mountains are old enough, and the communities rooted enough, that a bad stretch of trail can keep its name long after the original incident is gone from public memory. A place may be called dangerous by people who cannot fully explain why anymore. That does not always mean the danger is imaginary. Sometimes the explanation has simply been compressed. The story wore down the way the ridges did, losing detail but keeping shape. This is also why locals are often difficult to impress with scenic marketing. A brochure might advertise solitude, untouched wilderness, hidden gems and rugged adventure. A local may hear that and think, yes, that means poor access, limited signal, muddy footing, and visitors who mistake remoteness for charm until they need to get out quickly. Neither view is entirely wrong. They are just aimed at different outcomes. One sells experience, the other remembers consequences. There is a useful humility in that. The oldest mountains do not reward arrogance for long. They are not especially interested in a person's confidence level, fitness tracker, or conviction that this hike could not possibly be as difficult as people say. In fact, the mountains have watched countless generations arrive with some version of that idea. The land remains. Human certainty does not. And that may be the clearest form of mountain memory there is. Not a literal recollection, of course, but a pattern that keeps repeating. People come in assuming they know what they are dealing with. The mountains adjust that assumption. The lesson gets passed along. Some hear it and adapt, some do not. Then the next group arrives. Over time, the communities that live closest to that cycle become very good at recognizing where optimism tends to go wrong. So when a local avoids a certain trail, the decision may rest on far more than one bad story or one steep section. It may come from living in a region where the land itself has had millions of years to become intricate, where paths overlay older paths, where weather and vegetation multiply difficulty, where history lingers under the leaves, and where caution has been refined into habit by people who have learned, repeatedly, that these mountains keep teaching the same lesson in different ways. Once you see the Appalachians like that, not as mild hills but as very old terrain with deep local memory, it becomes easier to understand why some trails unsettle people before anything visibly dramatic has happened at all. The ground has already done enough over time to earn that reaction, and the woods, as we move deeper into them, only add to it. That age and memory shape the land itself, but they also shape the way people move through it. Because once a mountain has had enough time to become complicated, and once a community has had enough time to learn those complications the hard way, something else begins to appear on certain trails. It is not always danger in the obvious sense. Sometimes it is simply the feeling that a place is not behaving, the way a pleasant daytime trail is supposed to behave. That feeling matters more than many people like to admit. Most of us are very comfortable believing in danger after dark. Darkness is easy to understand. It hides things, shortens your range of vision, changes sound, and invites every old instinct your ancestors ever used to stay alive. Daylight, by contrast, is supposed to reassure. If the sun is out, if the path is visible, if birds are calling somewhere in the trees, then the mind assumes a basic level of safety. Yet some Appalachian trails manage to feel wrong, even when the light is good, the weather is decent, and the hour is still early enough that you ought to be enjoying yourself. That wrongness can be difficult to explain, especially to someone who has not spent much time in the woods. It is rarely a dramatic movie moment. Nobody needs to whisper that they suddenly felt a chill, while a violin screeches somewhere off camera. It is usually much quieter than that. A trail feels off because the normal cues that help the brain stay relaxed begin to break down. The space feels too still, or too enclosed, or strangely exposed in the wrong places. The path may remain visible, but the terrain around it starts to feel less readable. Your attention sharpens. You notice details more than before. A bend ahead stops looking inviting and starts looking inconvenient. Without deciding to, you begin checking how far you are from the trailhead, how much time has passed, and whether continuing is actually worth it. That is often the first sign. Not fear, exactly. Recalculation. The human brain is built to scan environments constantly, even when we're trying to relax. In ordinary settings, the process is so smooth we barely notice it. A sidewalk, a park, a familiar road, a well-marked trail near a visitor centre. The brain checks for exits, landmarks, nearby people, useful boundaries, and the general likelihood that anything unpleasant is about to happen. If the environment provides enough reassuring signals, your nervous system settles down. In the woods, the same process continues, but the signals become harder to interpret. Dense forest reduces visibility. Uneven ground demands attention. Sound travels in ways that are not always easy to locate. The result is that some trails keep the brain working harder than others, and when the brain works harder without finding many reassuring answers, the whole place begins to feel wrong. Appalachian trails are especially good at producing this effect because so many of them pass through dense, mature forest. Mature forest has its own kind of beauty, but it does not always flatter the nerves. The canopy can be thick enough to dim broad daylight into something flatter and cooler. Sunlight reaches the ground in patches instead of broad open certainty. Trees stand close enough together to limit long views. Shrubs and laurel close in along the edges. In some places, the trail becomes less like a route through scenery, and more like a narrow agreement between you and the landscape. You may proceed here, the woods seem to say, but only here. That narrowing can create tension without any actual crisis taking place. People like options, even when they have no intention of using them. We like being able to see around things. We like knowing where the open ground is. We like understanding how to leave if we choose to leave. A trail that takes away those comforts can produce unease in full daylight because the body notices confinement before the mind has put words to it. Then there is silence, or what passes for silence in a mountain forest. Appalachian woods are never completely silent. There are insects, birds, wind in the leaves, water moving over stone, the small crackle of branches adjusting, and the occasional sound that turns out to be nothing more sinister than gravity being untidy. Still, there are moments when the soundscape changes so abruptly that the shift feels personal. Bird activity drops, wind settles, even the usual background rustling seems to pause. It is not supernatural, it is simply noticeable. Human beings are pattern readers. When the pattern changes, attention increases. Locals often recognise this without making a speech about it. They know that woods have moods. A trail can feel normal one day, and unpleasant the next, even if no map has changed. Temperature, humidity, cloud cover, recent rain, animal movement, and the season all affect how a place feels. In late summer, a section of trail may be crowded with sound, heat, and green growth. In winter, that same route can feel exposed, skeletal, and severe. During leafless months, the sightlines improve, but the landscape can become harsher, every ravine more visible, every old structure or stone foundation more obvious than before. In spring, streams swell and the ground softens. In autumn, dry leaves hide roots and holes under a layer of innocent-looking colour. A place that is technically the same is never really the same. That changing mood matters because people do not assess danger in a vacuum. They assess it in real time, based on sensation as much as logic. One of the reasons some trails feel wrong in daylight is that the senses are receiving mixed messages. The eye says, "It is daytime, visibility exists, proceed normally." The rest of the nervous system says, "Perhaps not with such confidence." A trail might also feel wrong because its shape keeps interrupting your sense of progress. Some paths in the Appalachians do not unfold cleanly. They twist through hollows, cross and recross streams, follow old road beds for a while, then peel away into steeper ground. They dip, rise, narrow, and bend so often that it becomes difficult to form a simple mental model of where you are. This matters more than it sounds. Human beings are comforted by orientation. We like being able to say, at least roughly, the car is that way, the ridge is over there, the creek runs down there, and home is ultimately somewhere beyond all this. When a trail resists that picture, the walk becomes mentally heavier. It is not unusual for people to describe such places in emotional language because emotional language is often the nearest tool available. They say a trail feels strange, heavy, wrong, dead, close, tense, or bad. Sometimes those words hide a practical explanation. The trail is poorly drained. The vegetation is thick. The route has too many false turnoffs. The slope is steeper than expected, and there is no clean place to recover if you slip. The ravine holds cold air. The rock walls block sound. The cell signal vanished 20 minutes ago. No single detail is overwhelming on its own, but together they produce a feeling that the place is not friendly to mistakes. That friendliness toward mistakes is something experienced locals read constantly. A good easy trail forgives a lot. You can be distracted for a moment and still recover. You can walk a little too fast and not immediately regret it. You can stop paying close attention, and the environment will not take advantage of the lapse. A bad trail, or even an ordinary trail under the wrong conditions, forgives much less. One missed marker becomes a wrong turn. One wrong turn becomes unnecessary distance. Unnecessary distance becomes fatigue. Fatigue becomes poor decisions. It is not hard to see why the body might start objecting before the conscious mind has completed the calculation. Another reason daylight does not always help is that daylight in the Appalachians can be deceptive. In open country, sunlight creates clear relationships between landforms. In heavily forested mountain terrain, sunlight often reaches you in fragments. A bright day overhead may still leave long stretches of trail in cool shadow. If fog drifts through, or a cloud bank settles low over the ridge, the quality of light changes again. Everything remains visible, but not comfortably visible. Edges soften, distances flatten. Wet roots shine just enough to catch the eye without making footing clearer. Rock faces become darker than they looked from below. A place can feel dim in the middle of the afternoon, not because the day is ending, but because the mountain has decided to edit the light to its own preference. People from the region often speak about this in very plain terms. They say a place gets gloomy, or it holds shadow, or it stays dim. Those are simple phrases, yet they carry real observational weight. A trail that holds shadow all day stays wet longer, dries slower, grows slicker, and can feel colder than expected. A cove that keeps mist late into the morning may look beautiful from a camera's point of view and mildly suspicious from a hiker's knees. One person sees atmosphere, another sees a longer trip back if anything goes wrong. Then there is the matter of old routes and half-routes. Many Appalachian trails overlap with older human use. Logging grades, wagon traces, hunter paths, utility cuts, abandoned roads, unofficial side trails and local shortcuts can all leave marks on the landscape. Some remain obvious, others appear only briefly, just enough to tempt a person who likes the look of a clearer path. This can create a peculiar kind of unease because the land keeps hinting at choices without explaining them. A turn appears where no turn is marked. A worn path drops toward water. Another climbs away through the trees. You know one of them is likely less useful than it looks, but unless you know the area, you do not know which. Even staying on the correct route can feel less secure once you have seen how many almost routes the mountain is willing to provide. That uncertainty produces a strong daylight wrongness, because it attacks one of the mind's favourite comforts, confidence in the path itself. A trail is supposed to answer one basic question for you. Go this way. When that answer starts to wobble, tension follows. You begin paying closer attention to blazes, footprints, cut logs, and any sign that another human being recently agreed this was still the correct direction. If those signs become inconsistent, the woods start to feel less like a landscape and more like a test you never agreed to take. The body's reaction to this is worth noticing. Unease in the woods is not only a thought, it is physical. Shoulders tighten, hearing sharpens, pace changes. Some people speed up to get through the odd stretch. Others slow down because rushing suddenly seems foolish. Conversation drops off. Breathing becomes more deliberate. Even people who arrived in excellent spirits may become quieter when a place feels wrong, and that quiet is not always fear. Sometimes it is concentration. Sometimes it is respect. Sometimes the brain has simply decided there is too much information to process and would appreciate fewer jokes for a while. That last part may disappoint the more enthusiastic hiker in the group, especially the one who was planning to narrate every leaf as though auditioning for woodland radio. Still, mountains do have a way of editing personalities. A trail that seemed like a good setting for cheerful confidence can, after a mile or two, turn everyone into much more serious versions of themselves. It is also possible for a place to feel wrong because of what is missing. No recent footprints, no sounds of other hikers, no obvious maintenance, no cut branches, no sign that anyone has come through lately. This absence registers differently depending on experience. Some people find it peaceful, others find it concerning. Locals tend to judge it in context. An empty trail near a popular area may be a relief. An empty trail that is oddly empty for the season, time, or weather may suggest that other people know something you do not. Even if the explanation is harmless, the feeling persists. On top of all this sits local story. Story does not create every uneasy trail, but it absolutely changes how a trail is perceived. If you've heard that a place is trouble, the mind enters differently. It notices more, it interprets more. A rusted gate, an old foundation stone, a faded sign, a sudden drop in temperature under thick shade. Any of these can feel heavier once a warning has been attached to the place. Outsiders sometimes mock this as superstition, but that misses the point. Story is one of the ways communities compress experience. That trail is bad news can stand in for a long list of incidents, conditions, near misses, and inherited caution. It may also stand in for something harder to phrase, namely that enough people over enough time have had enough of a bad feeling there that nobody sees the point in arguing with the pattern. In Appalachian communities, that pattern recognition can be very practical. A person may not believe every strange tale they heard growing up, but they still learned which ridges to leave alone in bad weather, which hollows get confusing after lunch, and which routes are not worth doing alone. One lesson can sit next to another. Folklore and common sense are not always rivals. Sometimes they are just two methods of keeping people from wandering somewhere unwise, and sometimes the wrongness is entirely human. Certain trails feel bad because they lead through isolated spaces where you would rather not meet the wrong person. Old camps, illegal dumping spots, abandoned buildings, forgotten access roads, and remote areas with poor visibility all change the atmosphere of a place. Even during the day, a person can feel exposed on a trail that offers too little visibility and too much uncertainty about who else uses it. Locals may know this without saying it directly. A vague warning can be kinder and safer than a detailed one, especially when speaking to strangers. What makes daylight unease so persuasive is that it arrives before the dramatic part. It is preventive rather than reactive. A place feels wrong, so a careful person turns back, chooses another route, or decides not to come back alone. Nothing happens, which is exactly the point. The absence of disaster does not prove the feeling was silly. It may prove the feeling did its job. This is one reason experienced hikers and mountain people tend to respect instinct without worshipping it. They do not assume every uneasy moment means a ghost is filing paperwork nearby. They also do not dismiss the body's early warning system just because it cannot always explain itself elegantly. Instinct is often the result of observations arriving faster than language. A tiny shift in light, the smell of water rising somewhere, the angle of the slope, the realization that the trail has not looked maintained in a long while, the odd stillness of a place where sound should be livelier. The mind gathers the data. The body delivers the message first. Visitors sometimes miss this because they are looking for obvious danger. They expect cliffs, bears, storms, or a giant sign saying "bad idea, turn around." Instead, they encounter something subtler, a trail that simply never relaxes. It remains narrow, enclosed, damp, repetitive, and difficult to read. The footing asks too much. The turns come too often. The woods feel too close. Progress seems oddly slow. The place may be beautiful, but beauty does not always calm the nerves. Sometimes it only sharpens the contrast between what the eye likes and what the body distrusts. By then, a local would likely already be somewhere else, perhaps on a different trail with better views, drier footing, and far fewer opportunities to become a story told later on a porch. That choice can look unromantic from the outside. It is actually one of the most intelligent things mountain communities do. They learn not only which places are dangerous, but which places ask for too much vigilance to be worth the trouble. And once you begin to understand how a trail can feel wrong before anything clearly visible goes wrong, the next piece starts to make more sense too. Because few things intensify that feeling faster than fog, silence, and the way the woods can change mood without asking anyone's permission. Because once fog enters the picture, and once the usual sound of the woods starts behaving differently, that low daylight unease can become something much more persuasive. Not dramatic, not theatrical, and not necessarily supernatural, but very convincing all the same. A trail that felt merely inconvenient a few minutes earlier can suddenly feel like a place that has stopped offering clear terms. The route is still there, the trees are still there, you are still moving forward. And yet the whole setting seems to have changed its attitude. Fog is one of the simplest reasons this happens, and one of the most effective. It does not need to be thick enough to hide the world completely. In fact, the most unsettling fog is often the kind that leaves just enough visible to tempt you into thinking you still have a good grasp of the place. A full whiteout is obvious. It announces itself as a problem, but a thin mountain fog, the kind that hangs low between trunks, drifts across a trail, or sits in the folds of a hollow while the upper branches still catch some light, is more complicated. It softens edges. It shortens distances. It makes every turn look less informative than it did a moment ago. You can still see, technically. You just stop seeing clearly enough to feel confident. That matters a great deal in the Appalachians because so much of the landscape is already enclosed by trees. In open country, fog may reduce a wide view. In eastern mountain woods, it reduces what was already a limited view and then flattens whatever remains. The ridge ahead stops looking like a ridge and becomes a pale wall of trunks. The drop-off to one side grows less legible. A trail marker that should stand out becomes easier to miss. You begin walking not through a broad landscape, but through a much smaller pocket of uncertainty, and the pocket moves with you. People often describe this as the woods closing in, which is not inaccurate. Fog does not actually pull the trees closer, of course, but it changes the space between them. The air becomes a surface. Depth shrinks. The forest stops offering any real distance and gives you only the next few yards. This has a practical effect on navigation, but it also has a psychological one. Human beings do not relax easily when depth disappears. We like having some sense of what lies ahead. Fog removes that without needing to remove the trail itself. There is another reason fog works so well on the nerves. It interferes with pace. A clear trail invites a steady rhythm. You look ahead, choose your steps, and move with some confidence. In fog, especially on uneven Appalachian ground, that rhythm breaks. You slow down. You check things more often. You hesitate before bends. Every rock, root, slick patch and side path demands more attention, because the usual visual information is no longer doing enough of the work for you. A walk that should feel ordinary starts to feel negotiated, almost as if the mountain has decided that each step now requires a little more thought than before. Locals are familiar with this because mountain fog is not rare, and because it does not always arrive in a dramatic way. It can settle in from a low cloud layer, rise from wet ground after rain, cling to a cool hollow while the surrounding region seems perfectly normal, or drift across higher elevations as temperature and moisture shift. One section of trail may be clear while the next holds a grey softness that changes the whole mood. A visitor may treat this as charming atmosphere at first. And it is atmospheric, certainly. Very photogenic. Ideal if your goal is to produce pictures that suggest thoughtful solitude and expensive hiking socks. Less ideal if your goal is to read the terrain accurately and get back before conditions worsen. Silence works alongside fog in a way that is harder to measure and easier to feel. Woods are rarely silent, but they do change their sound in ways that people notice quickly. There are times when the normal background of the forest seems to thin out. Fewer birds, less insect noise, wind dropping away just enough to leave your own movement sounding louder than it should. In a city, silence often means a brief break from noise. In the mountains, a sudden hush can feel like information. Sometimes it is information. Birds quiet down for practical reasons, wind changes, weather shifts. Animal movement alters the soundscape. Water that seemed loud from one angle vanishes around a bend because the shape of the land is redirecting the sound. The forest is constantly rearranging what you hear, yet because humans are pattern readers, we respond strongly when the pattern changes. A trail that has been lively with small sounds and then becomes strangely still will usually feel different even if the mind cannot explain why. This is one of the reasons some locals say a place has a mood. Mood is not a scientific term, but it is often an efficient one. It gathers many small changes into a single judgment. The air feels heavier, the light goes flatter, the usual sounds drop away, the trail narrows or becomes wetter, the rhododendron starts leaning in close, visibility falls, the ground asks for more caution. None of this proves anything mystical. It does mean that the woods are no longer giving you easy reassurance. And once that reassurance is gone, the mind begins running its checks more often. You can see this happen in groups. When a trail feels open and readable, people talk more. They look around casually. Someone tells a story. Someone else complains about their knees in a tone that suggests they are still in good spirits. Maybe there is a snack discussion, which, as everyone knows, is one of the great signs of social confidence outdoors. But when the woods change mood, conversation drops, people stop drifting apart. The person in front checks the route more carefully. The person in back listens more. No one necessarily says, "This place feels wrong." They do not need to. Their behaviour says it. Fog contributes to that because it makes every sound harder to place. Sound in the mountains is already tricky. It bounces off slopes, gets swallowed by vegetation, follows drainages in odd ways, and changes with wind and humidity. Add fog, and the world becomes even less reliable. Water can sound closer than it is. A branch cracking somewhere off the trail can seem to come from the wrong direction. Voices from another group, if there are any, may carry strangely or not at all. At times you hear something and cannot decide whether it is on the trail, below you in the hollow, or far up the ridge. That uncertainty is not dangerous by itself, but it is tiring. It keeps the brain occupied. The Appalachians are particularly good at this because of their shape. Folded terrain, wooded slopes, narrow coves, creek bottoms and ridgelines all affect how sound behaves. A person walking through a broad western landscape may hear a distant call and place it reasonably well. In dense Appalachian woods, the same certainty is harder to come by. The forest filters sound through trunks, leaves, elevation changes and moisture. Things arrive blurred. This is charming when it's only birds and running water. It is less charming when you're trying to work out whether a noise ahead means another hiker, an animal, a branch settling, or your imagination being unhelpful again. An imagination is always part of the equation. That does not make the experience false. It makes it human. The brain does not simply receive a landscape. It interprets one. When visibility drops and sound becomes unclear, imagination moves in to help complete the picture. Sometimes it completes the picture badly. A stump looks like a crouched figure until you get closer. A hanging branch seems momentarily like movement. Mist between trees can suggest shape where there is none. A dark opening beyond the trail, which in clear weather would look like nothing more than a side drainage, now seems like a place that deserves a firmer opinion. That is why certain trails develop reputations faster in foggy or damp conditions than in perfect weather. The setting itself becomes more suggestive. The terrain has not changed, but its unreadability has increased. A place that was already demanding now becomes moody, and mood has consequences. People hurry, people miss markers, people stop trusting their sense of direction, people drift too far to one side to avoid mud or brush and then have to refine the route. The trail has not vanished, it has simply stopped being generous. Silence also has a way of making time feel strange. In ordinary settings, time is tracked by activity around us. Cars pass, people appear, sounds change in predictable ways. On a quiet mountain trail, especially in fog, the usual markers thin out. You walk, and because the environment offers fewer clear changes, 10 minutes can feel longer than it is, or shorter. People begin to lose their sense of pace. They think they have been on a section for 20 minutes when it has only been 7, or they assume they are making good progress and discover that the trail has barely unfolded at all. This distortion may sound minor, but it affects decisions. When to turn back, whether to continue, how much daylight remains, whether the route is taking longer because it is longer, or because conditions are making every yard less efficient. Locals often compensate for this by relying less on feeling and more on habit. They know roughly how a trail should move under good conditions. If it suddenly feels much slower, there is a reason. Maybe the ground is bad. Maybe the fog is forcing too much caution. Maybe the route is not being read cleanly. Maybe the mountain is simply reminding you that it sets the pace. A visitor, by contrast, may assume the uneasy feeling is merely atmosphere and keep pressing on until the math becomes less favourable. There's also something about fog that amplifies memory. By that, I do not mean literal ghosts walking around with a schedule. I mean that people become more aware of story in places where the environment withholds clarity. If you have heard that a certain trail has a reputation, fog gives that reputation room to work. A normal stand of trees becomes a setting. An old stone wall feels more significant. A rusted can, an unmarked side path, a collapsed structure deep in the brush. Any of these details gather weight when the air is full of grey distance. The mountain has not changed what is there. It has changed how much certainty you bring to it. That is one reason folklore clings so well to wooded mountain regions. The landscape supports suggestion. It does not explain itself too quickly. A person can pass the same place on 2 different days and feel as if they visited 2 different versions of it. Clear weather makes it ordinary. Fog restores all the old stories in a hurry. Communities that live with these changes do not always separate the practical and the folkloric cleanly, because on the ground the two are often experienced together. A bad place to miss a turn can also be a place associated with a warning tale. A hollow that traps fog can also be a hollow where people say strange things have happened. The caution survives whether the explanation is weather, memory, or both. The woods themselves help create this effect through enclosure. Appalachian forests, especially where rhododendron or mountain laurel crowd the margins, can turn a trail into a corridor. Fog softens the top of that corridor while dense vegetation narrows the sides. There is a very basic animal discomfort in moving through a space where you can only see so far ahead, cannot easily see far to either side, and do not entirely trust how sound is reaching you. The body notices this before the mind finishes naming it. Heart rate nudges upward, attention sharpens, muscles prepare in small ways. No great panic is required. The place has simply become one that asks more from you than a walk is supposed to ask. Even experienced people feel this. Experience does not remove mood. It only helps interpret it. A skilled hiker in dense fog is not likely to start inventing woodland phantoms out of every fern. They are, however, likely to become more deliberate, more conservative, and less interested in any route that offers poor returns for high uncertainty. That is often what local avoidance looks like in practice. Not terror, not superstition, just a refusal to spend time on a trail that becomes tedious, risky, or unpleasant when the woods decide to lean into their less cooperative side. And fog is not the only culprit. Dampness in general changes the mood of the forest. A trail after rain smells different, sounds different, and handles differently. Wet leaves stick or slide. Mud pulls at boots. Rocks darken and shine. Roots become polished traps. Streams rise enough to change crossing points. Even the bark on trees looks different, darker and more textured, as if the whole place has been freshly developed in a photographic tray. The scene is beautiful, but beauty and comfort are not the same. Damp woods often feel older, quieter and more serious than dry woods. That seriousness can turn into unease on the wrong trail very quickly. Temperature plays a role too. Cold air settles in hollows. Mist lingers where the sun reaches slowly. You may step from one section of trail into another and feel the air drop without any dramatic reason. Again, there is usually a practical explanation. Drainage, shade, water nearby, elevation shift. Yet the body experiences it first as a message. This place is different. Pay attention. That message is useful. It makes people tighten jackets, check footing, and think more carefully about the route. It also contributes to the sense that some trails have a character of their own. People who know the region well often sound matter-of-fact about these mood shifts, and that matter-of-fact tone is worth noticing. They are not saying the woods are alive with intention in some grand cinematic sense. They are saying the woods have conditions, and conditions change what kind of place you are walking through. On a good day, a trail may be pleasant. On a wet, foggy day with poor visibility and a strange hush, the same trail becomes a bad bargain. That is enough to build reputation over time. If a route repeatedly turns unpleasant under common mountain conditions, locals begin to treat it accordingly. Then, of course, there are the moments when silence is not complete but selective. You still hear water. You still hear your own steps. You may hear a crow somewhere far off or the small tap of moisture dropping from leaf to leaf. But the fuller living sound of the woods seems reduced. This is especially unnerving because it feels less like emptiness and more like subtraction. Something was here, and now it is not. Whether that shift is caused by weather, time of day, or animal behaviour, the human response is similar. We notice when a place seems to be withholding itself. And in a heavily storied landscape like Appalachia, withholding invites interpretation. One person decides they are simply overthinking. Another decides it is time to turn around. A third keeps going and becomes convinced later that the whole area had a terrible feel to it from the beginning. This is how reputations grow. Not always through one dramatic incident, but through repeated small experiences that land in the same emotional category. Bad feel, odd hush, thick fog, hard to read, not worth it. Those phrases, repeated over years, become stronger than a formal trail review ever could. What is interesting is that many of these trails are not permanently sinister. They are conditional. Under clear weather and company, they may be manageable, even enjoyable. Under fog, with poor light, alone, or after rain, they become something else. That conditional nature is exactly why local knowledge matters so much. A visitor may hear people avoid that trail and assume the place is always dangerous in the same way. More often, the truth is subtler. The trail has certain moods, and some of those moods are not worth dealing with unless you know exactly what you're doing. The mountains do not need complete darkness to produce that effect. Daylight filtered through fog, sound softened by damp air, a trail enclosed by laurel, and the slow realization that the woods have gone quiet in a particular way can be more than enough. At that point, even a marked route begins to feel less fixed than it looked on the map. And that is where another layer of trouble begins. Because once the mountain has made distance and sound uncertain, it becomes much easier for the path itself to seem less reliable than it ought to be. And once a trail stops feeling fixed, it does not take much for a very ordinary walk to become a much more complicated problem. People often imagine getting lost as a dramatic event, some large obvious mistake with a soundtrack attached. In reality, many mountain navigation problems begin with something much smaller. The path narrows, leaves cover the tread. A bend around a rock outcrop seems to continue naturally, except it does not. A sidetrack looks just worn enough to seem correct. A tree falls across the route and everyone steps around it in a slightly different way. 10 minutes later, the trail that was supposed to be there has become uncertain, and the uncertainty is doing what uncertainty does best. which is expanding. This is one of the most important reasons certain Appalachian trails earn a bad reputation. They do not always disappear in the theatrical sense. The ground does not open, the signs do not leap into a ravine, and the mountain does not pull a vanishing act just to be difficult. What happens instead is subtler and more annoying. The trail becomes faint exactly when you most need it to be obvious. It fades at a stream crossing. It breaks apart in rocky ground. It dissolves under fallen leaves. It gets interrupted by blowdown. It merges with an older route, an animal trace, a logging remnant, or an unofficial side path that looks plausible enough for someone who has not been there before. The trail is still technically present, but it has stopped being generous. That loss of generosity is what catches people. A good trail tells you what to do even when you are tired, distracted, or not especially talented at reading terrain. It is visible. Markers appear where they should. Junctions make sense. The route behaves like a line. A difficult trail, especially in older Appalachian forests, may behave more like a suggestion. It asks you to notice tread pattern, cut branches, worn soil, paint blazes half hidden by bark texture, a gap in the brush, or the angle at which the route is trying to contour around a slope. If you miss one of those signals, the mountain does not correct you immediately. It simply lets you continue being wrong for a while. That is part of why locals avoid certain routes. They know which trails remain readable under ordinary conditions, and which ones begin acting unreliable as soon as leaves fall, rain comes through, maintenance slips, or fog starts flattening the terrain. A trail does not need to be remote in the absolute sense to be troublesome. It only needs enough weak points in the right places, a crossing where the tread vanishes, a rocky section with too many false continuations, a meadow edge where the line gets lost in grass, a ridge turn that is obvious only if you already know to look for it. Put several of those in one route, and the whole thing begins to depend less on the trail and more on the judgment of the person walking it. That judgment is rarely at its best by the time trouble begins. Usually a person has already invested time and energy. Maybe they started confidently because the first mile was clear. Maybe they are already a little damp from fog or recent rain. Maybe they have been looking down at slick roots for an hour and are mentally tired in the quiet way hiking can make people tired, where the legs still work but the brain would very much like fewer decisions. Then the trail reaches the one place where good decisions are required. It fades. The marker is old. The turnoff is not where expected. Water has changed the ground. Someone says, "I think it's this way," with exactly enough confidence to be persuasive and exactly not enough evidence to deserve it. That sentence has escorted many people into unnecessary trouble. In the Appalachians, trails often cross environments that naturally obscure human routes. One of the biggest offenders is leaf cover. In autumn, the forest floor can become so fully carpeted that the tread all but disappears. A path that was easy to follow in summer because the soil was packed and the edges were visible can become a vague corridor of similarly coloured leaves. Roots hide beneath them, holes hide beneath them, stones hide beneath them, the route itself hides beneath them. It looks beautiful, of course. The hills glow gold and copper, the trees look very pleased with themselves, and every tourism brochure in the region has a good month. But from the perspective of navigation, leaf season can be a quiet little trick. The problem is not only that the trail gets harder to see, it is that the alternatives begin to look equally reasonable. On a slope covered in leaves, an old drainage can look like a footpath. A deer track can look like the continuation of the route. A place where previous hikers stepped wrong and then corrected themselves can leave enough disturbance to suggest a line that is not actually useful. Once that ambiguity enters the picture, people start walking by guesswork, and guesswork on mountain terrain has a way of charging interest. Then there are stream crossings, which deserve their poor reputation honestly. Trails often become least clear where water intersects them. In a dry period, a crossing may seem simple. Stones are visible. The opposite bank can be read. A worn exit from the creek bed shows where the trail resumes. After rain, or in seasons of heavier flow, that same crossing becomes a puzzle. Water covers the usual stones. The bank is muddier. Multiple places on the far side look trampled. Footing becomes the priority, which is understandable, but the price of focusing on not falling in is that people often stop paying attention to where the trail actually continues. Once across, they find the nearest break in the brush and assume that must be the way. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is the beginning of a very annoying detour. Old roadbeds complicate matters in another direction. Throughout the Appalachians, remnants of older use remain on the land. Logging roads, mining access tracks, farm lanes, rail grades and utility routes can all linger long after their original purpose has faded. To a tired hiker, these old paths can look wonderfully convincing. They're wider than the trail, smoother underfoot and psychologically comforting. Human beings like a broad route. It feels official, substantial, trustworthy. The problem is that old roads go where old roads were meant to go, not where your current trail is meant to go. They may descend steadily into the wrong hollow, loop toward private property, dead end at a washed out cut, or simply carry you much farther from your intended route than you realise until the slope, stream pattern, or lack of markers forces an unpleasant conversation. That conversation usually begins with silence. Not dramatic silence, the practical kind. Everyone is suddenly looking around and not liking what they are seeing. No blaze on the last few trees, no signpost. The roadbed feels too easy or too wrong. The terrain does not match the map in anyone's head. Someone mentions checking the phone, and naturally this is when the signal becomes philosophical rather than useful. Even if the map app works offline, the little blue dot can be less comforting than expected when it drifts around under tree cover and insists you are either standing on the trail, standing next to the trail, or perhaps standing in a state of emotional ambiguity. Technology helps, of course. GPS, offline maps, route downloads, satellite imagery. All of these are real improvements over wandering through the woods with confidence and a sandwich. But they also create a particular kind of false security. Many people now expect the path on the screen to behave like a road on a car navigation system. They expect a clear line, an obvious position, and some friendly digital certainty that everything is under control. Appalachian trails do not always cooperate with that expectation. Under dense canopy, location can drift. Older trails may be mapped imperfectly. Unofficial paths may not appear at all, or may appear in ways that do not match what is happening on the ground. A hiker can be technically very close to the correct route and still spend a great deal of time not finding it. This is why experienced mountain people do not surrender their judgment to a glowing rectangle, however polite that rectangle may be. They use it as a tool, not a replacement for reading the land. They notice slope direction, water flow, the feel of the ridge, the time spent contouring versus climbing, the aspect of the mountain, and whether the terrain still makes sense for the route they thought they were on. A trail may vanish to the eye, but the land still says things if you know how to listen. The trouble is that many visitors are not used to reading those signals, and certain trails demand exactly that skill. Blowdowns add another layer of confusion. When storms bring down trees across a trail, the effect is not just physical obstruction, it is route disruption. People go around a fallen tree in different ways. One person skirts uphill, another downhill, another cuts wider than necessary, another follows the first visible gap and assumes the trail will reappear. After enough people improvise, the area around the obstruction becomes a mess of partial tracks. All of them look used. None of them looks obviously wrong. If the original tread was faint to begin with, the blowdown zone can effectively erase the route's clarity for a short but crucial stretch. A short stretch is all it takes. That is another thing mountain navigation teaches brutally well. You do not have to be lost by miles to be in trouble. Sometimes being off by one wrong drainage or one wrong side of a ridge is enough to turn a manageable walk into a serious problem, especially if daylight is fading or weather is shifting. In the Appalachians, terrain does not always forgive small directional errors because slopes channel you into consequences. Head downhill in the wrong place, and you may end up committed to a ravine that is much harder to exit than it was to enter. Follow a false path along a contour and you may find yourself too far from the real route to relocate it easily. Continue along the wrong ridgeline, and the mountain may happily let you do so for quite some time before presenting the bill. Game trails are another classic source of trouble, and deer, it must be said, are not trying to help. They produce narrow, worn paths through vegetation that can look surprisingly convincing, especially in dense cover. A deer trail often has exactly the qualities a human subconsciously wants in a route. It passes through the brush cleanly. It goes somewhere. It shows repeated use. The problem is that deer are perfectly content to take you somewhere highly inconvenient, such as straight down a steep slope through thick laurel into a creek bottom with no clean exit, or around terrain that makes excellent sense if you're a deer and less excellent sense if you're a person carrying a backpack and mild concern. What makes all of this more difficult is that trails do not vanish evenly. One minute the route may be clear, the next it weakens, then it reappears. Then it vanishes again at precisely the place where confidence has already been dented. This stop-and-start quality is hard on decision-making because it keeps rewarding hope. You think, there it is, we're fine. Then 5 minutes later the line dissolves again, and now the whole situation feels more personal. A route that stays consistently difficult can at least be respected. A route that alternates between clear and vague tends to lure people farther than they should go before turning back. Turning back, by the way, is often the smartest move and one of the hardest to make. People dislike surrendering progress. They dislike admitting that conditions, poor marking, or a fading trail have changed the bargain. They especially dislike doing so when they have come for a specific waterfall, overlook, rock formation, or local hidden spot recommended by someone who neglected to include several important details. Pride, schedule pressure, sunk effort, and the very human hope that the trail will surely become obvious just beyond the next bend all combine to keep people moving when moving is no longer the best idea. Locals are often better at resisting that trap because they know there is nothing noble about making a simple navigation problem into a rescue. They also know which trails are notorious for this exact behaviour. Not always famous trails either. Sometimes the troublesome route is just some old local path that has never fully transitioned into a well-maintained recreational trail, yet continues to attract enough curious walkers to stay half alive. Those are often the worst kind, too visible to disappear entirely, too neglected to be trustworthy. Just enough stories attached to them that newcomers think they are discovering something special, when in fact they are discovering why everyone else now chooses a different route. Season changes make this even more complicated. In summer, heavy growth can choke the edges of a trail, hide blazes, and close up sight lines. In autumn, leaf cover obscures the tread. In winter, the bare woods may improve visibility, but reveal how faint the path actually is, while snow or ice redraws the ground altogether. In spring, runoff erodes sections, new mud forms, and creek crossings become less predictable. A trail that is manageable in one season can become a poor choice in another, and local knowledge often includes these seasonal judgments in a way maps rarely do. Signage is not always enough to solve the problem. A sign at a trailhead can be clear while the trail itself remains inconsistent. Markers can fade. Trees with blazes can fall. Junction signs can weather away, be vandalized, or stand at angles suggesting they have experienced some disappointment. The Appalachians contain many beautifully maintained trails, but they also contain routes where maintenance is partial, irregular, or simply behind the needs of the landscape. Forests are active places. Water moves soil. Trees come down. Growth returns quickly. What was obvious last year may not be obvious now. This is one reason rescue teams and long-time locals often talk about trails in terms outsiders do not always appreciate. They are not just thinking, can someone walk there? They are thinking, can someone still read the route when tired, wet, late, and a little bit scared? That is the real test. A trail that vanishes when everything is going well is an inconvenience. A trail that vanishes when you're trying to get out quickly is a hazard. and trails tend to vanish most convincingly when people are already under pressure. Late afternoon, bad weather rolling in, a minor injury, fog thickening, the realization that the hike took longer than planned. Those are the moments when a person needs a path to be obvious, and those are exactly the moments when unreliable routes become dangerous. The mind narrows, decision quality drops. Little features that might have been interpreted correctly an hour ago are now just one more thing to process. If the trail requires careful reading at the very moment careful reading is hardest, that trail has earned every cautious word spoken about it. You can see why locals learn to be selective. They know the routes that keep their shape, the ones that lose it, and the ones that seem almost spitefully inclined to become unclear at every critical point. They know which crossings get messy, which ridge turns are easy to miss, which old roads lure people off course, and which hidden destinations are hidden mostly because the way there is not worth trusting. They know too that once a person leaves the main line in certain parts of the mountains, finding the path again can be much harder than it sounds. Forests look orderly from a distance. Up close they are full of repetition. That repetition is what makes vanishing trails so effective. Trees repeat, slopes repeat, drainages repeat, openings in the brush repeat. Everything offers just enough familiarity to seem plausible, and just enough variation to keep you from being certain. The mountain does not need to hide the trail completely. It only needs to make several things look almost correct. In that situation, a person can walk confidently in the wrong direction for quite a while, which is one of the least useful outdoor skills there is. None of this means the mountains are malicious. It means they are indifferent, and indifference is more than enough. The trail was never a permanent object. It was always a temporary agreement between human use and a landscape that keeps growing over, washing through, dropping trees across, and quietly rearranging itself. Some agreements hold well because they are maintained, well-designed, and frequently travelled. Others weaken, and once a trail weakens enough, locals notice. They stop recommending it. They mention it with a shrug. They say, "That one gets confusing." They say, "You can lose it around the creek." They say, "I wouldn't fool with that route unless you know it." That last phrase carries a lot, because knowing a trail in the Appalachians does not just mean having walked it once. It means understanding where it fails, where it fades, where it lies to the eye, and where the shape of the land tells you what the route ought to be doing, even when the tread itself has become coy. That kind of knowledge rarely appears in brochures, but it survives very well in local memory, especially in places where certain hollows and ridges have taught the same lesson often enough that the people who know them no longer need much explanation at all. And that is the point where local knowledge begins to matter more than any map can fully explain, because once a trail is capable of fading, splitting, and misleading, the question is no longer just where the path goes. The real question becomes which parts of the mountain people who know it well have quietly learned not to trust. In the Appalachians, that often comes down to hollows and ridges. Those two words sound simple enough. A hollow is a low, narrow valley, often tucked between slopes, usually with a creek or drainage running through it. A ridge is the higher spine of land between valleys, sometimes broad and easy to walk, sometimes narrow, steep, and unpleasantly willing to punish sloppy footing. If you are not from mountain country, these may sound like basic geographic features with a little regional flavour. If you are from mountain country, especially from the Appalachian kind, you know those features come with personality, behaviour and reputation. Locals learn this early, often without realising they are learning it. A child grows up hearing that one hollow stays damp long after rain, another gets darker earlier than expected, a certain ridge catches lightning, a gap in the mountain funnels wind hard enough to make winter feel personal. One side of the slope holds ice, another grows slick with leaves. A creek crossing at the bottom of a hollow can go from manageable to unwise in less time than people from flatter country would consider polite. By adulthood, a person may not remember where they learned each piece of that knowledge. They just know it. That kind of knowing is different from reading a route description. It is less formal and often more useful. A guidebook may tell you elevation gain, mileage, and the location of a scenic overlook. A local may tell you, that ridge is fine until the weather turns, or don't go down into that hollow after heavy rain, or that trail looks easy on paper, but that last stretch fools people. Those remarks can sound vague if you're not used to hearing them. In practice, they are often the most important information you will get. Part of the reason is that hollows and ridges change how mountains behave. A hollow may feel protected because it is lower and enclosed. Sometimes it is. Other times it is the exact place where damp air settles, fog lingers, streams rise fast, and daylight gets reduced to a flat grey long before sunset. In a narrow hollow, steep slopes can limit your view so much that you lose any larger sense of the land. You stop being in a mountain range and start being inside one small channel of it. Sound changes, air changes, light changes, distances become harder to judge. A trail through a hollow can feel close and ordinary in the morning, then oddly enclosed and heavy by afternoon, especially if the weather shifts or clouds roll over the ridgetops. Locals know which hollows do that. They also know which ones stay cold. Cold is not just an inconvenience in the mountains. It affects water, footing, decision-making, and how long a trail remains wet after a storm. A hollow that holds cold air can keep ice longer into the morning. Mud lingers. Rocks stay slick. A section that looked harmless in a photograph from July becomes a different kind of place in November. The same goes for shade. Some hollows receive so little direct light, depending on slope orientation and tree cover, that they develop a permanent dampness. Not literally permanent, but close enough for practical purposes. Moss thrives, wood decays, root systems stay slick. The ground gives less back when you step on it. These are not dramatic conditions, but they are exactly the sort of conditions that produce a long trail history of slips, hesitations, wrong turns, and muttered regret. Then there are the ridges. Visitors often think ridges are the safer option because they are higher, more open, and easier to orient from. Sometimes that is true. A good ridge trail can be a pleasure. Better breeze, clearer direction, fewer creek crossings, more confidence in where the land is going. But ridges come with their own rules, and locals know those too. Some ridges are broad and forgiving. Others are narrow enough that a minor lapse in attention becomes a real problem. Some are lined with loose rock that shifts underfoot. Some are heavily rooted and slick after rain. Some collect wind in ways that make balance, temperature, and visibility noticeably worse. And some ridges, especially where they curve, split, or flatten unexpectedly, are very good at tricking people into following the wrong spur. That last point matters more than it sounds. In Appalachian terrain, a ridge does not always behave like the neat line you imagine from a map. It may branch, it may lower and rise again in a way that obscures the main route. It may produce side spurs that feel every bit as reasonable as the one you are meant to follow. If a trail is poorly marked or interrupted, those ridge variations become a problem quickly. A person who drifts onto the wrong spur may keep going for quite a while because ridge travel often feels coherent. The land still seems to make sense. You're still up high. The walking is still possible, it just is not taking you where you intended. Locals often describe ridges with strange precision. Not formal surveying language, but practical language. They know which ridge is the one that fools people, which one gets ugly in wind, which one looks easy from below, which one drops off sharper on the east side, which one isn't bad until the last stretch, and which one I'd leave alone if there's any weather coming. Again, these are not dramatic declarations. They are the small-spoken version of long experience. There is another layer here, and it has to do with how communities attach stories to terrain. A certain hollow may be known as trouble, not because one terrible event happened there, but because many smaller bad outcomes have accumulated over time. Someone got turned around, someone got hurt crossing the creek, someone underestimated how dark it gets down there. A hunting party had a bad time in fog. A hiker followed the drainage and ended up farther off route than expected. A rescue took longer than it should have because access was poor. No single event becomes famous. Together they create caution. The same happens on ridges. A place may build a reputation because weather catches people there. Another because there is one exposed section with a full risk that visitors keep underestimating. Another because wind and mist make footing worse than the photographs suggest. Another because a ridge trail invites speed and confidence right up until the moment it demands care. Once a place gathers enough of these incidents, locals stop needing to justify their opinion every time. They simply know it is a route with a pattern, and patterns are what mountain communities trust. That trust in pattern is one reason outsiders sometimes misread local warnings as superstition. They hear, "People don't like that hollow," and assume the explanation is folklore alone. But often what sounds like superstition is compressed memory. A person may mention a strange feeling, yes. They may mention old stories, yes. They may also be expressing in very compact form that the place has a long track record of producing trouble in ways that repeat. The trouble may be environmental, historical, social, or some mixture of all three. From the outside, the warning sounds soft. Underneath it is usually quite hard. There are also practical reasons certain hollows and ridges stay avoided even when they are technically accessible. Some pass through awkward boundaries between public and private land. In parts of Appalachia, land ownership can be complicated, and old routes may cross places that were once informally used and are now less welcome. A local may know exactly which ridge you should not wander over, because the descent on the far side puts you in a spot where you really should not be. They may know which hollow has old structures, hunting use, or signs of activity better left undisturbed. They may not explain all of this to a stranger in detail. They may simply recommend a different trail. That recommendation may save you a good deal of trouble. Another thing locals know is how easy it is for a hollow or ridge to change character with the season. A ridge that is pleasant in early autumn may be risky in winter once wind and ice arrive. A hollow that is manageable during a dry week may become miserable after prolonged rain. Spring can turn lower roots into wet, churning inconveniences. Summer growth can close up sight lines and make a narrow hollow feel much more enclosed than it did when the leaves were down. These changes are not dramatic surprises to people who have watched them year after year. They are simply part of how the mountain works. For a visitor, though, the route may seem inconsistent in an almost personal way. Last month it looked harmless. Today it feels like a trap with ferns. The direction a slope faces matters too, and locals almost always know this better than newcomers. North-facing hollows and ridges can hold moisture and cold longer. South-facing slopes may dry faster, but they can also feel hotter, more exposed, and more tiring than expected. East-facing routes catch morning light differently from west-facing ones, which matters more than it sounds when trying to judge timing and visibility. A local may avoid one side of a mountain under certain conditions, not because they are overly cautious, but because they know exactly how that side handles weather, light, and footing. They have watched it too often to be impressed by optimism. There is a particular kind of local phrase that appears around this point in mountain conversation, and it is worth paying attention to. Someone will say a place is bad ground. Not evil ground, not cursed, just bad ground. That phrase can cover many things. Loose footing, unstable slope, poor drainage, confusing route, rough access, nasty brush, frequent washouts, hidden hazards, ugly weather exposure, or simply a section that becomes more difficult than it is worth. Bad ground is one of those quietly efficient expressions that contain years of observation without pretending to be more precise than needed. Hollows are often where that phrase gets used with the most conviction. They collect problems, water goes there, fallen trees go there, cold air goes there, fog settles there, trails can become channels of runoff, stream crossings multiply, laurel thickens, rescue access worsens. If a person gets injured in a narrow hollow, extracting them is rarely simple. Even without an injury, a hollow can become a place where the trail feels slower, wetter, and more enclosed than expected. After enough people have had enough trouble in one of those settings, it stops being a trail locals feel any need to recommend. Ridges, meanwhile, collect different kinds of bad ground. Exposure, wind, loose stone, false confidence, long stretches without water, misleading side routes, difficult descents. A person can spend a pleasant hour on a ridge and then discover that coming off it safely is where the real work begins. Some ridges in the Appalachians look broad from below, but narrow unexpectedly near outcrops or cliffs. Others hide steep drop-offs behind brush. Others lull people into quick movement because the walking seems easy, only to demand careful footing where fatigue has already started to build. Locals know these sequences. They know where the ridge stops being charming. Another thing they know, and this is one outsiders often underestimate, is that certain hollows and ridges have social reputations as much as natural ones. One hollow may have long been associated with illegal dumping, rough access roads, hidden camps, or activity no one feels like stumbling into. One ridge may attract exactly the sort of visitor who mistakes danger for personality. Another area may be known for rescues, missing turns, careless social media hidden gem recommendations, or a history of people getting in over their heads because someone online described the trail as easy if you're in decent shape, which is one of those phrases that has caused trouble in more places than it has ever helped. Locals hear those descriptions and often respond the way experienced people always do, which is with deep skepticism. They know that mileage is not the whole story. Elevation is not the whole story. Official trail status is not the whole story. A hollow with poor footing, several crossings, and no clean way out can be worse than a longer route with better design. A ridge with one bad exposed section can turn a moderate hike into a serious problem for the wrong person on the wrong day. And because local people tend to think in terms of consequence rather than marketing, they are usually less interested in whether a place is worth it from an adventure standpoint, and more interested in whether it is likely to produce unnecessary trouble. That can make local caution seem unimpressed, even stubborn. In truth, it is often the opposite of stubbornness. It is adaptability. People who know mountain country learn that there is rarely any need to prove yourself to one route in one set of conditions. There is almost always another hollow, another ridge, another trail that will give you beauty without asking for so many compromises in return. The land is too full of options to waste time on the places that have built a reputation for being expensive in all the wrong ways. Still, some places keep their hold on community memory more strongly than others. A hollow where an old settlement once stood, a ridge where weather has surprised too many people, a gap where the wind turns mean, a cove where sound carries oddly and fog settles hard. A trail line that was once useful when local use was different, but now remains mostly as a way for the mountain to test strangers. In these cases, the knowledge can become almost inherited. A person avoids the place partly because they have had their own experience there, and partly because they absorbed years of other people's judgments long before they ever set foot on it. That kind of inherited caution is easy to mock from a distance, and hard to dismiss on the ground. Because once you have spent enough time in the Appalachians, you begin to understand that the land does not have to explain itself fully every time. A hollow can feel like more trouble than it is worth, because its design keeps producing trouble. A ridge can make people uneasy because too many small things go wrong there too often. A route can be technically passable, and still belong to the category of leave it alone unless you really know it. Local knowledge exists partly because maps and official descriptions tend to flatten those distinctions. Communities do not. They remember which places keep surprising people in the same direction. They also remember that what begins as mild inconvenience in a hollow or on a ridge can turn more serious very quickly once weather gets involved. A route that is merely awkward in still air can become foolish in wind. A narrow hollow that is only damp in fair weather can become a problem when rain arrives. A ridge that offers decent footing in dry conditions may become a long lesson in regret when a storm rolls over it. And because the mountains are very good at changing conditions faster than visitors expect, that local judgment about hollows and ridges often becomes even more important the moment the sky starts looking uncertain. And that is where the mountains often make their point most clearly, because a trail that seems manageable under stable conditions can change character very quickly once the weather starts moving in. This is one of the reasons locals speak so carefully about certain routes. They're not only thinking about the trail in good weather, on a calm morning, with dry footing and easy visibility. They're thinking about what happens when the air shifts, the clouds lower, the wind changes direction, and the mountain decides that the version of the day you planned for is no longer available. People who do not spend much time in mountain country often underestimate how quickly weather can alter the quality of a place. They imagine danger as something separate from the landscape, almost like an event that arrives from outside. In the Appalachians, weather is not separate from the landscape. It is one of the main things that gives the landscape its behaviour. A trail in clear weather is one place. The same trail in a building storm is another. Add fog, wet rock, dropping temperature, and moving wind, and it becomes another place again. None of this requires especially dramatic conditions. The mountain does not need a grand catastrophe. It only needs enough change, at the wrong time, in the wrong spot. That is often what locals mean when they say weather turns fast. They do not necessarily mean a violent storm appears from nowhere like an offended movie villain. More often they mean the day stops being reliable. A blue morning becomes a grey afternoon. A comfortable breeze becomes a steady wind that makes ridge walking less pleasant. A humid stillness shifts into cloud build-up. A little rain becomes sustained wetness, and sustained wetness on Appalachian ground has a way of creating several problems at once. Footing worsens, visibility drops, layers that seemed optional become necessary. Time estimates stop being accurate because every section now takes longer. The trail does not disappear, but it stops being simple. One of the most common mistakes visitors make is assuming that the weather at the trailhead represents the weather of the whole route. In flatter places, that assumption can hold reasonably well for a while. In mountain country, not so much. Elevation changes matter, exposure matters, orientation matters. A ridge can have wind while a hollow below feels still. A valley can look clear while cloud is building above the crest. A sunny parking area can give way, an hour later, to damp shade, mist, and chill higher up the slope. Even within the same outing, a person may move through several different versions of the day. Locals know this because they have learned not to trust first impressions. A calm start proves very little. In fact, one of the more misleading things the mountains can offer is a peaceful beginning. The air is mild, the trail looks inviting, the light through the trees is pleasant, and everyone feels pleased with the decision to be outdoors. Then the route climbs, or turns along a more exposed stretch, or enters a hollow where moisture lingers, and the whole feel of the day changes. Someone reaches for a jacket. Someone else notices the wind has picked up. The light goes flatter. The ridge ahead starts gathering cloud. Nothing has happened in a dramatic sense, but the mountain has started revising the terms. That revision is especially important in the Appalachians because these mountains often hide weather until you are already committed. Tree cover limits the long view. Ridges block sight lines. Cloud can gather beyond the next rise while everything around you still looks manageable. By the time the signs become obvious, you may be far enough along a route that turning back is no longer emotionally easy, even if it is clearly the smarter option. This is how ordinary people drift into trouble, not through recklessness alone, but through one reasonable choice followed by another, each made a little later than ideal. Rain is perhaps the most underestimated part of this. Many hikers think of rain as inconvenience first and hazard second. They picture getting damp, maybe muddy, perhaps annoyed in a respectable outdoorsy way. In the Appalachians, rain often deserves more respect than that. Even moderate rain changes the ground quickly. Rocks become slick, roots turn glossy, packed soil softens, steep sections become less secure. Leaf cover, which was already hiding the trail in places, now sticks to everything or slides underfoot. A descent that would have been merely tiring becomes technical enough to demand full attention. Progress slows, and slower progress means longer exposure to the very conditions causing the slowdown. Then there are the stream crossings. A creek that looked innocent on the way in can become much less agreeable after rain, even when the rainfall has not seemed impressive from where you're standing. Water collects from slopes, hollows, side drainages and narrow channels. Small creeks rise faster than people expect, especially in terrain built to move water downhill efficiently. A crossing that was a simple matter of stepping stone to stone can turn murky, faster and harder to read. The rocks disappear, the current presses harder, the far bank looks muddier and less certain. Suddenly the trail's return route is no longer just a retracing of the outward walk, it is a new problem waiting in a familiar place. Locals think about this before it happens. That is part of what makes their caution sound almost casual. They are not only reacting to visible storm clouds, they are already imagining what the trail will be like if the creek comes up, if the rocks get slick, if the hollow holds fog, if the ridge starts pulling wind, if the descent takes twice as long in wet conditions. A visitor may think, it is only drizzling. A local may think, this trail is now a worse bargain than it was an hour ago. Those are very different ways of understanding the same weather. Thunderstorms deserve their own share of respect, not only because of rain, but because of exposure and timing. In the Appalachians, a trail can move a person through multiple risk zones in one outing. Dense woods may feel sheltered. An open, bald, rocky overlook, ridge spine, or exposed summit section can suddenly feel much less charming once thunder is within range. Lightning risk is one of the clearest reasons locals avoid certain routes under uncertain weather. A ridge that is pleasant in calm conditions becomes a very poor place to be when storms are building. Open ground, isolated trees, metal equipment, and the simple fact of being one of the taller things in a bad location all make that problem less theoretical than some people prefer. And mountains have a way of complicating storm timing. Sound can be deceptive. Thunder may seem farther than it is, or closer, depending on terrain and cloud cover. A storm system can be masked by ridges until it begins spilling over them. Wind can arrive before rain. Temperature can drop fast enough to signal trouble without explaining how fast it is moving. Experienced people notice these shifts. They know that once the weather begins presenting those signs, the margin for leisurely decision-making is narrowing. This is where the phrase, without warning, deserves a little care. The mountain weather rarely turns without any warning at all. More often, it turns without the kind of warning an inexperienced person recognizes early enough. There were clues. The clouds built in a certain shape. The wind shifted. The air became heavier or cooler. A haze moved along the ridge. The light changed. Birds quieted. Distant sound behaved differently. But if you do not know to read those signs, the change feels sudden. To a local, it may still be unwelcome, but it is less surprising. That ability to read weather is one of the quietest and most valuable parts of mountain knowledge. It is rarely dramatic. No one is standing on a rock with a serious expression announcing the atmospheric pressure to the group. More often, someone just pauses, looks at the sky through the trees, feels the wind and says, "We should head down." The wisdom is not in the wording, it is in the timing. Leave too early and you lose an hour. Leave too late and you may spend that hour on wet stone, in low visibility, with a route that has suddenly become much less forgiving. Wind on its own can change a trail more than people expect. In sheltered woods, a breeze can feel welcome. On exposed ridges and higher routes, stronger wind makes footing less certain, raises fatigue, and changes how cold the day feels. It also affects sound. Voices carry oddly. The woods no longer seem still. Branches move in ways that make every side glance less useful. If the trail runs near drop-offs, loose stone or narrow tread, wind turns simple walking into a more deliberate task. A person who was already tired now has to fight for balance and warmth as well. Again, no drama required. The trail has just become more expensive. Cold is often underestimated for similar reasons. Many people imagine cold weather risk in terms of winter only, but mountains create pockets of chill under many conditions. Rain plus wind plus elevation plus slowed movement is often enough to make a person far colder than planned. A damp layer under trees in summer is uncomfortable. The same situation in shoulder seasons or at higher elevations can become serious quickly if someone is underdressed or has to stop moving for any reason. Hands stiffen. Judgment dulls. People become less willing to admit they are not doing well because they do not want to sound dramatic. Unfortunately, weather has never shown much gratitude for understatement. Locals know which trails magnify this. They know the ridge that catches wind hard, the hollow that stays cold, the route where there is nowhere good to stop, the long exposed section where a drizzle becomes a soaking, and the steep descent where cold wet feet turn a simple hike into a careful retreat. They also know that mountain weather is not merely a backdrop. It reshapes the whole trail. A route that is enjoyable when dry may become something they would not bother with in bad weather, not because they are timid, but because they understand consequence better than romance. Fog often arrives as part of this weather turn, and once it does, all the earlier problems multiply. The trail is wetter, the air is cooler, sound is less reliable, visibility shortens, markers become easier to miss, distances feel less accurate. A group that had been moving cheerfully now grows quieter and more compact. One wrong turn becomes more likely, but perhaps more importantly, one right turn becomes harder to trust. A person no longer feels sure they are moving through a landscape. They feel they are moving through a condition. That feeling can make ordinary choices harder. Continue or turn back. Remove a layer or add one. Cross now or wait. Push onto the viewpoint or accept that the viewpoint has become a grey wall of cloud, and your reward today is humility. People often joke about mountain weather humbling hikers, and fair enough, it does. But the practical point is that humility is useful. The sooner someone accepts that the day has changed, the better their decisions usually become. There is also the issue of false improvement. Weather in the Appalachians can tease. Rain eases for 10 minutes, and people convince themselves the front has passed. Fog lifts a little, and everyone becomes hopeful. A patch of blue appears through the canopy, and suddenly the group wants to continue. Then the next wave comes in, or the wind shifts, or the storm that sounded distant is suddenly much less distant. This stop-and-start behaviour is one reason locals are sceptical once conditions begin to turn. They know better than to treat a brief improvement as a guaranteed trend. The mountains are full of temporary optimism. Temporary optimism has led many people to spend longer on bad trails than they should. This is especially true on routes with poor escape options. Not every trail offers an easy bailout. Some continue along ridges with few sensible descent points. Some enter narrow hollows where the terrain channels movement whether you like it or not. Some require recrossing streams or committing to sections that become worse when wet. A local often knows this before setting out. They know which trails have decent retreat lines and which ones become awkward once the weather starts removing choices. That knowledge alone can be enough to avoid a route when the forecast is uncertain, even if the sky still looks mostly friendly at breakfast. Forecasts, by the way, are useful but not complete. Mountain weather frequently makes local variation out of broad regional guidance. A forecast may tell you chance of rain, general temperature, storm risk, or wind expectation. It does not always tell you what that will feel like in one particular hollow at 3 p.m. after the cloud settles, or on one exposed ridge when the breeze stiffens, or on one old trail with poor drainage and 2 awkward creek crossings on the way out. Locals treat the forecast as the beginning of the conversation, not the end of it. They also tend to respect what the mountains have been doing recently. Days of prior rain matter. Wind in the last storm matters. Seasonal transitions matter. Ground saturation matters. A trail can be problematic not because the current weather is terrible, but because the mountain is still carrying the effects of earlier weather. Soil stays soft. Trees come down. Small slides loosen footing. creeks remain high, mud remains deep. In other words, the day's conditions are only part of the truth. The land remembers the week. That memory can catch out people who assume fair weather erases yesterday's problems. A sunny day after heavy rain may look like a reward. On some trails it is. On others it simply means you get to enjoy all the mud and instability and better light. The same goes for wind damage. A route may be technically open after a storm, but if blowdowns now interrupt it, the trail's difficulty changes. You're climbing over, under, and around obstacles. The line becomes harder to follow. Pace slows, energy drains. Bad weather does not have to be happening at that moment to continue causing trouble. This is why locals are often conservative about route choice in the mountains. They are not only evaluating the sky, they're evaluating the whole recent relationship between weather and terrain. Has it been wet enough to make that hollow a mess? Has the ridge been windy enough to make those dead branches a concern? Has recent cold kept ice on the north side? Has runoff probably altered the crossing? These are not dramatic calculations. They are simply the sort of calculations that keep a person from becoming the subject of a long evening phone call. And once weather does turn badly enough, one more truth becomes obvious. Speed is not always the answer. Inexperienced hikers sometimes respond to bad weather by rushing. That is understandable. Rain is unpleasant, thunder is motivating, wind is annoying. But rushing on slick Appalachian ground can turn a weather problem into an injury problem, and an injury problem in turning weather is exactly the sort of combination that locals and rescue workers dread. Careful movement takes time. Time increases exposure. Exposure makes people impatient. Impatience causes mistakes. There is a grim little efficiency to the whole cycle. The best local knowledge often interrupts that cycle before it begins. It says not today. It says choose the easier route. It says be off the ridge early. It says skip the trail with the bad crossing. It says that if the weather is questionable, there is no special prize waiting at the far end of the route that justifies pretending the mountain owes you cooperation. Those choices can sound unexciting to people seeking a good story. In the Appalachians, however, good stories and good decisions do not always travel together. Weather is one of the main reasons. It removes the illusion that the trail exists in a stable state. It reminds everyone that a path is only as friendly as the conditions allow. Dry stone becomes slick stone, easy crossing becomes poor crossing, pleasant overlook becomes exposure, readable woods become fog and silence. A trail with a reputation for trouble does not need to become impossible. It only needs to become slightly worse at the exact moment the hiker becomes slightly more tired, slightly more hurried, and slightly less willing to turn back. That is enough. And it is why certain routes are discussed with such caution by the people who know them. Not because every storm becomes a disaster, but because every disaster in those mountains begins as weather, terrain, timing, and judgment meeting in the same place at the wrong moment. The people who understand that best are often the ones called when things go past ordinary trouble, because there are trails in Appalachia that local rescue teams never learn to take lightly, no matter how many times they have seen them before. And when things do go beyond ordinary trouble, when a missed turn becomes a search, when a minor injury becomes a carry-out, or when weather and terrain combine badly enough that someone no longer walks out on their own, the people who step into that situation are usually not casual observers of the mountains. They are the ones who know exactly how quickly a familiar trail can become a problem, exactly how far a person can drift off route without meaning to, and exactly why certain places keep appearing in rescue reports year after year. That is one of the clearest signals that a trail deserves respect. Rescue teams do not have the luxury of romantic thinking. They do not get to treat a route as mysterious in a decorative way. They see what actually happens when someone slips, disappears, misjudges daylight, underestimates weather, or follows the wrong path long enough for a manageable mistake to become a serious situation. Their view of the mountains is practical, patient, and usually stripped of all the nonsense people like to attach to difficult places after the fact. And because of that, When local rescue teams treat a trail seriously, it is worth paying attention. Across the Appalachian region, search and rescue work is often done by a mix of volunteer organisations, county responders, park personnel, sheriff's departments, emergency medical services, specialised rope teams, and people whose knowledge of the land comes from long experience rather than a glossy brochure. These are not people who are easily impressed by a steep hill and a dramatic internet caption. They know the difference between an honest hard trail and a route that repeatedly creates the same kinds of avoidable trouble. They know which areas are difficult to access, which descents turn treacherous when wet, which stream crossings complicate extraction, which ridges slow radio communication, and which quick little hikes have a remarkable talent for becoming all-day operations. That last category appears more often than visitors expect. A great many mountain rescues begin with plans that sounded modest. A short afternoon hike, a quick out and back, a local trail somebody recommended, a hidden overlook, a waterfall route someone online described as easy, except for one sentence near the end that should have received much more attention. By the time help is called, the story has changed shape. Someone has fallen, someone is overdue, someone turned around and never rejoined the group, someone is stuck below a ledge they climbed down more easily than they can climb back up. Someone followed a side path, lost the main route, and kept walking because they were convinced the trail would reconnect. Someone reached a creek crossing that had become unsafe. Someone underestimated how long it would take to return after the weather turned. Rescue teams learn these patterns because they have to. They also learn that certain trails produce them more often than others. That does not always mean the trail is the hardest in the region, or the longest, or the most remote in a dramatic sense. Sometimes the problematic trail is difficult in a more deceptive way. It attracts people who think it will be easier than it is. It begins gently and becomes rough later. It offers a popular destination, but does not advertise the awkward descent, loose footing, exposed edge, or confusing route finding required to get there and back. It may be relatively close to a road and still be extremely difficult to work in once someone is injured. In many cases, what makes a trail serious to rescuers is not just how people get into trouble there, but how difficult it is to get them out. That distinction matters. A hiker who twists an ankle on a smooth, wide path near easy vehicle access is one kind of problem. Unpleasant, yes, but often manageable. The same injury 2 miles down a steep Appalachian trail with wet rock, narrow tread, deadfall, poor radio coverage, and no clean carry route becomes something else entirely. The patient cannot simply be lifted out by optimism. People have to reach them, assess them, stabilise them, decide whether they can assist walk, package them if necessary, and then move them over terrain that may already be difficult for uninjured people moving freely. Add darkness, rain, fog, or cold, and the job grows quickly. This is one reason rescue teams never take certain trails lightly. They know the operational cost. They know which calls expand. One person is hurt, but it takes multiple rescuers to reach them. Gear must be brought in. Additional personnel may need to stage at different access points. Rope systems may be required. A carry-out may take hours. Communication becomes uneven. The weather that helped cause the problem continues to complicate the response. The trail itself, which had been merely adventurous to the original hikers, becomes a narrow workplace where every step has to be made carefully while carrying equipment and responsibility. It is easy, from a distance, to think of rescue as a final solution that simply arrives when needed. In the mountains, it is more complicated. Help comes through terrain, not around it. If the trail is rough for you, it is rough for the people coming in to assist. If the path vanishes at a stream crossing, it vanishes for them too. If the route involves a scramble, a ledge, a slick descent, or a narrow side slope, they have to negotiate all of it while doing far more than hiking. They are not just walking. They are carrying gear, making medical decisions, communicating with each other, and often managing a frightened, injured, cold, or exhausted person at the same time. Appalachian terrain is particularly good at making this work slow and physical. The forests are dense, access roads may be limited or misleading. Hollows can hide the exact location of the subject. Ridges may force long approaches. Water crossings complicate both entry and exit. Rhododendron, laurel and other dense vegetation can narrow movement into a miserable exercise in patience. A map may show that a person is not terribly far from a road in straight-line terms. Straight-line terms are not especially useful in mountain rescues. What matters is how the land actually allows movement, and mountains are rarely interested in straight lines. Locals know this instinctively. Rescue teams know it professionally. They also know how often trouble begins with familiar human habits. People leave too late. People assume the trail is well marked because it is popular online. People trust daylight to last longer than it does in deep hollows. People take shortcuts. People wear shoes better suited to polite sidewalks than wet roots and loose rock. People head out with too little water, no light, no map, and the kind of confidence that has never once improved footing on slick stone. None of these choices guarantees disaster. They do, however, make certain trails much less forgiving, and rescue teams see the results often enough to develop very clear opinions. Those opinions are not usually delivered with drama. They come out in the way responders talk about routes. A trail is known for falls. Another is known for people getting cliffed out, which is a polite and very useful phrase meaning someone has managed to reach a spot they cannot safely continue from or return through. Another is notorious for navigation errors near a split, a bald, a creek, or a rock field. Another generates calls because people underestimate how steep the return climb will be once they are tired. Another produces injuries in the same exposed section over and over because the viewpoint is attractive and the approach encourages poor choices. Sometimes the most dangerous thing about a trail is not its worst feature, but the sequence of features. Easy start, increasing commitment, one difficult section, destination achieved, mood improves, group relaxes. Then the return begins in worse light, with more fatigue, perhaps in damp conditions, and suddenly the section everyone handled well on the way in becomes much less tidy on the way out. Rescue teams learn these sequences because subjects often call from the same places. Not always the most dramatic spot, but the place where the margin finally ran out. There is also a pattern involving social media and hidden gems, which rescuers have every reason to dislike. A place gets promoted as secret, stunning, wild, or not too hard if you take the right trail. The description is vague enough to sound charming and incomplete enough to be dangerous. More people show up, some are prepared, many are not. They assume previous visitors would not have recommended the route if it were genuinely difficult. They assume that because photos exist, the path must be straightforward. They assume that being able to see the destination means being able to reach it safely. The mountains do not share these assumptions, and rescue teams end up dealing with the difference. This is not only about inexperience. Experienced hikers get into trouble too, especially in places where conditions deteriorate quickly. A loose step on a steep descent does not care about your resume. A wet ledge remains a wet ledge. A lightning-producing storm is not impressed by the number of peaks you've already climbed. The difference is often that experienced people call the day earlier, carry more useful gear, and recognize the moment when persistence stops being admirable. But even then, there are trails so awkward, exposed, or changeable that rescuers approach every incident there with extra care. Certain Appalachian trails build this reputation regionally. Volunteer teams and local responders may know them before the phone even finishes ringing. A call comes in from a specific waterfall approach, a cliff-lined route, a poorly marked backcountry junction, a ridge scramble, or a gorge descent, and everyone already has a sense of what the operation is likely to involve. Not because they are pessimists, but because the place has established a pattern. The access is bad. The footing is worse in rain. The route narrows. Carryouts are slow. Darkness becomes a factor. Helicopter use, if even possible, is limited by canopy, weather, terrain, and safety. Every trail has its personality. Some have operational personalities that rescue teams never forget. One of the most sobering parts of mountain rescue is how ordinary many calls sound at the beginning. A separated hiker, an overdue pair, a minor leg injury. Someone cannot find the trail. A family is stranded at a crossing. A person has gone off route toward a view and cannot get back up. In ordinary daily life, those problems might sound manageable. In a difficult hollow or on a bad ridge, they can become multi-hour, multi-agency efforts. Night falls, temperatures drop, batteries die. The caller's location is vague. The person is scared, which makes instructions harder to follow. The terrain turns every 100 yards into work, and night changes everything. Rescue teams in the Appalachians are very aware of how quickly a navigation issue grows once daylight goes. A trail that is only confusing in the late afternoon can become nearly unreadable in darkness, particularly under tree cover. Headlamps help, but they also narrow vision to a tunnel and flatten depth in unpleasant ways. Reflective markers, if present, may be missed. Side paths look more plausible. Sound becomes harder to place. The injured person, if there is one, gets colder and more fatigued. Responders themselves must move more deliberately, because rushing at night on rough mountain terrain is a good way to create additional patience, which no one needs. This is why local warnings about don't be out there after dark are not old-fashioned fussiness. They are often distilled rescue knowledge. Certain trails are manageable in decent light and very poor choices without it. A route with several creek crossings, a steep descent, or faint junctions does not become 10% harder at night. It can become a different problem entirely. Rescue teams know which trails have this effect. The public often learns only after the fact, usually in wet clothes. Weather, of course, compounds all of this. A rescue on a dry summer evening is one thing. The same rescue with rain, wind, or fog is another. Wet ground slows movement. Stream crossings become more dangerous. Patients chill faster. Rope work becomes more complex. Visibility worsens. Communication can degrade. Trails that teams know well in fair weather become more laborious under storm conditions. And because weather often contributes to the original incident, the responders do not get to work in neutral circumstances. They enter the same turning environment that caused the problem in the first place. If this sounds exhausting, it is because it is. Mountain rescue is often brutally physical, and the terrain does not become kinder simply because good people are trying to help. That fact alone tends to remove any lingering romance from badly reputed trails. A scenic overlook is still scenic, but if it sits at the end of a route that repeatedly injures people, strands them after dark, or traps them below technical sections they should not have attempted, rescue teams see the whole picture differently. The view is no longer the main fact. The access is. The consequence is. The pattern is. There is another thing rescuers understand well, and that is the distance between panic and practicality. People in trouble often describe their situation emotionally, which is natural. They are cold, hurt, embarrassed, frightened, lost, or all of the above. Rescue teams must translate that into terrain-based reality. Where are they really? Are they moving or staying put? Are they above or below the trail, near water or away from it? On the ridge, in the hollow, at the crossing, beyond the overlook, near a known landmark, or somewhere that only seems obvious to the caller because fear has simplified the world down to one rock and a tree they are now very invested in. On trails with a long history of incidents, teams develop a feel for these descriptions. They know the usual confusion points. They know the landmarks people misidentify. They know the false assumptions callers tend to make. That knowledge is invaluable, and it often comes at the price of repetition. The same trail, the same slippery section, the same hidden turn, the same route where people leave the main path chasing a better view, and then discover that gravity is much more persuasive on the way back up. The same long return after a waterfall, The same place where one member of a group realizes they cannot continue, but everyone is already too deep in to solve the problem quickly. Over time, these repeated incidents harden into caution among both rescuers and locals. A trail may remain open, it may remain beautiful, it may even remain popular, but the people who deal with its consequences do not take it lightly. Volunteer rescuers in mountain communities often carry another kind of knowledge too, one that blends official response with local culture. They may have grown up hearing which routes were trouble. They may have hunted nearby, worked nearby, or walked those woods for years before ever wearing rescue gear. That gives them a perspective outsiders do not always appreciate. They are not only reading maps and coordinates, they are reading reputation. They know which hollow gets fogged in, which ridge turns slick, which old path draws curious people for reasons the terrain does not really support, and which stretch always seems to collect trouble after a spell of rain. In mountain country, that combination of formal response skill and inherited local knowledge is one of the most useful things you can have. It is also why local advice is so often more conservative than visitors expect. From the outside, a warning can sound vague. I wouldn't mess with that trail. That one gets people. Not after rain. Not late. Not if you haven't done it before. Those sentences may sound almost casual, but they often stand behind years of practical evidence. Rescue teams have walked in where others could not walk out. They have carried people over the same slick routes and steep side slopes that everyone else treated as part of the adventure. They have seen the cheerful trailhead mood transformed into cold fatigue and bad decisions before dark even fully settles. Their caution is earned. None of this means the mountains should be feared in a theatrical way. It means they should be taken seriously in the way people who know them already do. The problem with certain trails is not that they are evil, it is that they are expensive. They charge in footing, time, attention, weather exposure, navigation demand, and consequence when things go wrong. Rescue teams understand that very well. They know which routes collect avoidable mistakes, which ones punish small errors, and which ones ask too much of people who arrive expecting a manageable outing and a nice photograph. And once a trail acquires that sort of reputation, the stories begin to gather around it more tightly. Not all of those stories are precise. Not all of them stay entirely practical. Over time, communities add older warnings, family tales, odd details, remembered incidents, and the sort of local superstition that often grows around places where enough bad outcomes have repeated, for long enough that plain caution starts borrowing the language of folklore. And this is where the practical side of the mountains begins to blend with the spoken side. Because once a trail has produced enough trouble, people do not preserve that knowledge only through maps, rescue reports, and stern reminders about proper footwear. They preserve it by talking, quietly, often indirectly, sometimes with humour, sometimes with a straight face, and sometimes in a tone that makes it very clear that the details are less important than the conclusion. Do not go up there. Do not go there late. Do not go there alone. Leave that route alone when the weather is turning. Take the ridge if you must, not the hollow. Stay on the marked path. If you hear something odd, keep walking. If it gets dark, you turn around. This is how stories begin to work on a place. In the Appalachians, stories and warnings have always moved well through families and communities because they fit the landscape. The region is large, heavily wooded, and full of places where direct experience matters. For much of its history, people learned what they needed to know from neighbours, relatives, church members, hunters, loggers, farmers, miners, and whoever else had already made enough mistakes to become worth listening to. That kind of knowledge does not arrive dressed as lecture. It comes as conversation. Someone mentions a trail. Someone else says they would not bother with it. An older relative names a ridge and makes a face. A neighbour says a hollow has always been bad news. Nobody produces an official report. Nobody needs to. The warning has already done its work. What makes Appalachian warning stories so effective is that they are usually not delivered like entertainment, even when they are entertaining. They tend to be told in a matter-of-fact way. A person is not trying to impress you with their ghost story performance. They are telling you the kind of thing people in that area have said for years. A certain road feels wrong after dark. A path that cuts off the main trail never seems worth taking. A particular gap on the ridge has had too many bad incidents. An old home site deep in the woods is not a place to linger. There may be a little smile while they say it, or a shrug, or the sort of dry humour mountain communities often use when discussing things that are not actually funny. But the tone is still practical. The point is not to thrill you. The point is to get you to remember. That is important, because memorable warnings travel further than detailed explanations. Don't go there. People disappear is not statistically precise, but it stays in the mind. Don't take that path after rain, because it crosses slick stone, loses its tread near a drainage, and becomes difficult to follow in low light, is a better technical summary, but it does not grip the imagination in the same way. Communities have always known this, even if they would not phrase it like that. A warning with a story attached survives. A warning without one often fades. So over time, practical caution and local superstition begin sharing the same coat. That does not mean people are foolish. It means people are efficient. If a hollow produces fear, confusion, bad weather, accidents, and a long trail of odd local anecdotes, no one feels especially obliged to separate those elements with scientific neatness before telling the next person to stay out of it. The whole bundle travels together. A child hears that you do not go into a certain section of woods after dusk. Maybe the original reason involved rough terrain and poor visibility. Maybe it involved moonshiners generations ago. Maybe it involved a bad fall, a feud, an old death, an abandoned structure, or one of the many small incidents that get rounded into bad things happen up there. By the time the warning reaches the next generation, all of those layers may still be present, even if they are no longer sorted cleanly. This is one reason outsiders often misunderstand Appalachian superstition. They hear a strange local warning and assume it is pure folklore, detached from real life. In truth, folklore in mountain regions is often one of the ways real life gets stored. A person may not believe every tale in a literal sense, yet still take the lesson seriously because the place in question has long been associated with risk, discomfort, or trouble. The line between this is haunted and this is where people get hurt can become thinner than people expect, especially when both statements have been repeated in the same family for 50 years. There is also a social reason warnings stay indirect. In many communities, especially smaller ones, people do not always explain everything to strangers. They may not know you well enough. They may not feel like getting into the history. They may think you would not understand the context, or worse, that you would treat it as an invitation to go looking for excitement. So the warning stays short. Locals don't go there. Leave that trail alone. There's nothing up there worth finding. To an outsider that can sound evasive. Often it is protective, and not just of you. It protects the place, the history attached to it, and the people who would rather not see an already difficult area turned into somebody's weekend dare. Some warnings are passed down almost like household rules. Children hear them before they are old enough to test them properly. Do not wander into that hollow. Do not cut through those woods. Do not whistle out there at night. Do not answer if you hear someone calling and you cannot place where it is coming from. Do not leave the path to look for the old cabin. Go around by the road instead. Be back before dark. Stay out of the creek when the rain has been hard upstream. These rules may come with stories, or they may come with no explanation at all beyond a look that says this is not a subject for negotiation. As people grow older, they may reinterpret those rules. The child who once imagined something supernatural in the trees may later recognise the practical reasons. Whistling at night may have been discouraged because sound travels badly, because people did not want children wandering out to investigate, because there were hunters in the area, because there were strangers in the area, or simply because mountain communities have always understood that darkness in the woods changes things. Yet even after the practical explanation becomes clear, the old rule often remains in place. It survives because it worked. And some warnings never need much reinterpretation. Old mine land, unstable structures, family cemeteries, forgotten wells, washed-out roads, dangerous overlooks, and rough unofficial trails all gather stories fast because the human mind prefers narrative to hazard labelling. A boy broke his leg there in 1987 because the footing failed near an abandoned cut is a historical detail. That place has never been right since is the version that gets remembered at a kitchen table 20 years later. Both may refer to the same piece of land. One is a record, the other is a warning system. Then there are the places where history itself becomes unsettling enough to do the work of superstition. The Appalachians hold old settlements, old graves, old roads, old disputes, and old tragedies in a very quiet way. A modern trail may pass near the remains of a chimney, a stone wall, a family cemetery behind iron fencing, or an orchard that outlived the house it once served. Sometimes there is a sign explaining the history. Often there is not. The forest simply holds the trace. Locals may know what was there. Visitors may only feel that the woods have suddenly become less empty than they looked a moment before. That sense of older human presence often attracts stories, and not without reason. If a place has seen hard living, sudden death, isolation, poverty, violence, or years of abandonment, people will talk about it in ways that combine respect, curiosity, and caution. A trail that passes such ground becomes more than a route. It becomes a corridor through remembered lives. It is not hard to see how that gives rise to warnings that sound half practical and half haunted. The mountain may be dangerous enough on its own. Add old memory, and it starts to feel personal. Family feuds and local conflicts have also left their mark on how certain places are discussed. Appalachian communities have long memories, and some pieces of land carry stories that are not for casual retelling. A ridge may once have marked a boundary people did not cross lightly. A hollow may have been associated with trouble during Prohibition, during the logging years, during mining disputes, or during some local conflict outsiders never hear about. Even when the original conditions are gone, the tone can remain. People avoid that side. Don't fool around over there. Nothing good ever came out of that hollow. It may sound dramatic, but drama is not the point. The point is that the place has a history heavy enough to shape behaviour long after the details have blurred. Warnings also become more persuasive when they are attached to repeated small experiences rather than one grand event. Someone heard footsteps where there should not have been any. Someone else got turned around on a trail they knew well. Another person said the woods were too quiet. A hunter saw lights where no one should have been. A group found the old route and then could not find it again on the way back. A hiker felt watched on a stretch of trail that was otherwise ordinary. None of these things is decisive on its own. Put enough of them together over decades, and the place acquires a reputation. A reputation does not need courtroom evidence. It only needs consistency. This is especially true in areas where the landscape is already good at producing uncertain sensory experiences. Fog, dense cover, shifting sound, changing light, and limited visibility all help stories settle into the ground. A person hears one warning, then goes to the place and experiences a few odd but explainable moments. The warning becomes more believable. They tell someone else, perhaps in a less dramatic way than they first heard it, but they still pass it on. The story softens, hardens, and changes as it moves. Practical details get trimmed, the atmosphere stays. Before long, a quiet local caution has become part of the identity of that trail. It is worth noticing how often Appalachian warnings are passed down quietly rather than publicly. You do not always see big signs explaining that a route has a strange reputation. You hear it from somebody, a grandparent, a cashier in a country store, a volunteer firefighter, a guide who knows the area, a landowner, someone sitting on a porch who only comments because you mentioned the wrong trail by name. These are not official channels, but they are often the channels people trust most. They carry not only information but tone, and tone tells you whether a warning is casual, exaggerated, half-joking, or the sort of thing you should hear once and take seriously. There is also a long Appalachian tradition of not saying more than necessary. That cultural habit shapes how stories survive. A person may tell you just enough to keep you out of trouble and no more. Maybe because they are private. Maybe because they do not enjoy explaining themselves. Maybe because too much explanation turns a warning into a challenge for the wrong kind of listener. If you tell some people that a hollow has a strange old history, they avoid it. If you tell others, they decide to make it their Saturday plan. Locals know this, so they choose their words carefully. They may sound vague on purpose. That vagueness has an interesting side effect. It leaves room for the imagination, and the imagination is highly efficient at decorating places with more detail than they strictly need. Once a trail is rumoured to be odd, every feature supports the rumour. The silence feels heavier. The old foundations feel sadder. The bend in the creek feels less ordinary. A snapped branch becomes evidence of something rather than a branch doing what branches do in a forest. Yet even this tendency has a practical side. If the end result is that people move more carefully, stay on the main trail, and stop wandering off into unsafe ground, the story has still done something useful. Mountain communities have always understood that fear can be instructive. Not panic, but a healthy unwillingness to treat certain places lightly. In that sense, superstition often functions as a behavioural guide. It teaches attention. It teaches restraint. It teaches the idea that not every path is there for you to explore just because you can see where it starts. It also teaches humility. The old warnings do not say the land owes you clarity or safety. They say the land has its own patterns and that foolish confidence tends to end badly. Some of the quietest warnings are the most effective because they carry no performance at all. A person simply declines to go. They know the trail, they know the weather, they know the stories, and when invited they say, "No, I'm good." That response can tell you more than a whole hour of dramatic storytelling. It means the reputation has moved past entertainment. It has entered habit. There is, of course, a danger in romanticising all this too much. Not every local warning conceals ancient mystery. Sometimes a bad trail is just a bad trail. Sometimes a place feels wrong because the footing is awful, the light is bad, and the mosquitoes are conducting themselves with criminal confidence. Sometimes an old story has grown far beyond its practical origin. Communities are made of people, and people enjoy exaggeration in moderation, especially when there is coffee involved. Still, exaggeration does not usually survive for generations unless it attaches itself to something more durable. The place keeps giving the story reasons to remain. One of the more revealing things about these warnings is how they handle outsiders. Locals may tell each other a long version of a story and give visitors only the short version. That difference is not always unkind. It reflects trust, familiarity, and the fact that stories do more than communicate facts. They place people inside a community's understanding of the land. If you grew up hearing a trail discussed a certain way, you inherit not just the content of the warning, but the attitude behind it. You know how serious it is supposed to sound. You know which details are playful and which are not. Outsiders often hear only the surface and miss the calibration. This is why internet retellings of Appalachian stories so often feel wrong to people from the region. They flatten everything into spooky entertainment. They strip away the local tone, the practical caution, the family memory, the dry humour, the social context, and the simple fact that many of these warnings are meant to guide behaviour, not generate content. The result is a distorted picture where the mountains become a stage set for endless menace, instead of a real place where communities developed efficient ways to keep each other out of trouble. The real warnings are usually less flashy and more useful. They say that some trails are not worth testing. They say the mountain has already shown enough people the same lesson. They say you do not need first-hand proof of every local reputation. They say the stories are there for a reason, even when the reason has become larger, softer, or stranger in the retelling. And perhaps most importantly, they say that fear and curiosity often travel together. because for every person who hears a warning and decides to avoid a place, there is another who hears the same warning and feels more drawn to it than before. That is part of how these trails keep their hold on people. The story is meant to keep you away, but it also gives the place an outline in the imagination. Now there is a ridge with a reputation, a hollow nobody talks about plainly, a path that locals avoid without making a fuss, a place where rescue teams know the terrain too well, a route where history, weather, bad footing, and old memory all seem to meet. For some people, that combination sounds less like a warning and more like an invitation. That response is deeply human, and it is one of the reasons these stories never quite die. The quiet warnings remain in circulation, doing their practical work, but they also leave behind a second effect. They create interest. They make certain places more vivid than safer, friendlier trails ever become. A well-marked, pleasant path may be the wiser choice. It is rarely the one people whisper about. The trail with the bad feel, the old story, the rescue history and the local caution becomes the one that stays in the mind. And once a place has done that, once it has become more vivid in memory than in maps, it becomes much easier to understand why people keep going back to the very mountains they have been warned about. Even when the warnings are clear, the stories are old, and the sensible choice has been sitting nearby all along. And that is where the whole matter becomes especially human, because warnings do not only repel people, very often they attract them. The same local sentence meant to keep someone away can have the opposite effect on the wrong listener, or perhaps on the perfectly ordinary listener with just enough imagination and just enough confidence to think the rule might not apply to them. A trail is described as one locals avoid, and suddenly it becomes more interesting than all the other trails put together. A ridge has a bad reputation, and now it feels important. A hollow has stories attached to it, and now it stops being just a low piece of land and becomes a place with a kind of gravity. That pull is not unusual. In fact, it may be one of the most predictable things about people. Human beings are drawn to edges. We like boundaries, but we also like peering over them. Tell us a place is ordinary, and most of us respond appropriately by continuing with our day. Tell us a place is avoided, whispered about, repeatedly warned against, and full of local memory, and now we have a problem. The imagination steps in. The place begins to glow in the mind. It becomes more vivid than the dozens of safer routes nearby. We start to picture the path, the trees, the bend in the trail, the silence, the half-heard stories. We do not know much about the place, but that is exactly what gives it power. It is unfinished in the mind, and unfinished things tend to linger. That is one reason curiosity keeps pulling people back to the same mountains that have already made their local opinion quite clear. Curiosity is not always reckless. Sometimes it is thoughtful, respectful, even cautious. A person hears there is a trail with a strange reputation and wants to understand why. They do not necessarily want danger, they want explanation. They want to see whether the place matches the stories. They want to know if the bad feeling is real, if the weather changes as quickly as people say, if the route is truly as confusing as claimed, if the old warnings were practical all along, or if generations of local caution have wrapped a fairly ordinary trail in something larger than itself. That urge to compare story with reality is very strong. It is part of how people learn. We do not simply inherit a warning and leave it alone forever. Many of us want to test it, or at least witness it. That does not mean the warning has failed. In a strange way, it may mean the warning has succeeded too well. It has made the place memorable enough that ignoring it becomes harder than investigating it. And mountains, of course, are excellent places for this sort of curiosity, because they rarely explain themselves all at once. A city street tells you most of what it is in a few seconds. So does a beach, a parking lot, or a supermarket aisle. Though I admit one can sometimes encounter profound mystery in a supermarket aisle if one is tired enough. A wooded trail in Appalachia does not reveal itself so easily. It unfolds slowly. One turn gives way to another. Light changes. Terrain shifts. The place can remain uncertain without becoming unreadable, which is precisely the condition that keeps curiosity alive. If the trail were obviously impossible, people would avoid it. If it were obviously harmless, the stories would lose their force. It sits in the middle, where many of the strongest fascinations live. There is also the appeal of forbidden knowledge, and the Appalachians offer that in a particularly strong form. Not because the mountains contain magical secrets waiting in neat little packages, but because local knowledge often feels partial from the outside. Visitors hear fragments. A trail is bad. A hollow is not worth entering. A ridge gets strange in weather. People do not say more than that. They shrug, change the subject, or laugh softly in a way that suggests they know quite a bit more than they are willing to explain. That incompleteness is extremely effective. It creates the impression that there is something behind the warning, something layered, something not fully available to outsiders. Once that impression forms, curiosity does the rest. A person begins imagining what locals know. Perhaps they know the route is genuinely treacherous. Perhaps they know old stories tied to the area. Perhaps they know of accidents, disappearances, illegal activity, family history, or all of those at once. Perhaps they are simply tired of strangers treating a difficult place like a theme park. The outsider rarely knows which explanation is correct. In many cases, several are correct at the same time. That uncertainty is exactly what makes the place difficult to forget. It cannot be filed away neatly. There's another pull at work too, and it has less to do with mystery and more to do with identity. Many people like to think of themselves as the sort of person who goes where others will not. Not foolishly, they would say, not arrogantly, just independently, self-reliantly, brave enough to see for themselves. This self-image is very persuasive. It makes local warnings sound less like information and more like a challenge to personal character. People avoid that trail because most people are too cautious, but perhaps I am not. That is not always spoken aloud, but it is often sitting quietly in the background. Mountain trails with reputations are excellent at attracting that mindset. They offer a test that feels personal and secretive at the same time. Unlike a crowded, famous destination, an avoided trail seems to promise something private. You're not just visiting scenery, you're proving something about yourself. That can be intoxicating. It can also be unhelpful, because mountains do not share the human interest in self-definition. They are not handing out certificates for persistence. Still, the pull remains. People want to compare themselves to the place. Can they handle it? Will they feel the same wrongness others describe? Will they notice the silence? Will they understand what locals mean after only one walk? Or perhaps, if the day goes easily, will they conclude that the warnings were exaggerated all along? Many do exactly that, and for a while they may even be right. Conditions can be kind. The route can hold together. The weather can stay stable. The creek can be low. The trail can feel entirely manageable. A person returns and thinks, I do not know what everyone was talking about. Then another person goes on a different day, under slightly worse conditions, and understands immediately. This inconsistency is part of what keeps curiosity alive. Problematic Appalachian trails are often not consistently dramatic. They are conditional. On one day they seem ordinary, on another they feel entirely different. That gap between reputations and experience makes people keep testing them. A trail that was awful for one person may be merely tiring for another. A route that frightens someone in fog may feel almost tame in dry autumn light. This difference in experience creates argument, retelling, and debate. Some insist the warnings are overblown. Others insist the place is bad news. The truth sits somewhere in the middle, changing with weather, timing, skill, and plain luck. And plain luck has a great deal to do with how people interpret mountains. A person who gets away with a poor decision often mistakes luck for understanding. That is true almost everywhere, but it seems especially common in outdoor settings where the consequences do not arrive every single time. Someone leaves too late, takes the vague side trail, crosses the slick rocks, hurries the descent, and still comes out with nothing worse than damp socks and a strong opinion. It becomes very tempting to think the place was overhyped. What they usually mean is that the place did not collect payment that day. Curiosity, having been rewarded rather than punished, becomes even stronger next time. There is also the lure of unfinished stories. The Appalachian Mountains are full of places that do not explain themselves completely. A half-collapsed foundation in the woods, a roadbed going nowhere obvious, an old cemetery behind trees, a section of trail that looks more used than maps suggest. Locals saying just enough to suggest that the route used to matter differently than it does now. These details trigger a very basic human response. We want to know what happened. We want the missing piece. We want the old name, the earlier purpose, the reason a place feels more inhabited by memory than by people. That kind of curiosity is not foolish at all. It is one of the most understandable responses a landscape can provoke. The difficulty is that curiosity about history, memory, and local story often leads people onto terrain that requires more practical respect than their interest has prepared them for. They set out looking for explanation and discover they have also signed up for steep footing, weak route finding, weather exposure, and an increasingly quiet forest. The story remains compelling, but the mountain insists on adding logistics to it. Modern media has made this pull even stronger. Photos, short videos, online lists of hidden Appalachian places, threads about the trail locals won't take, all of these compress reputation into temptation. A warning that once stayed mostly within communities can now circulate widely and lose much of its original tone along the way. What was once a local caution becomes a point of intrigue. What was once "do not bother, it is trouble" becomes "you have to see this weird trail everyone talks about." The internet is very good at removing the patient, grounded context from warnings and leaving only the glowing outline of mystery. This does not mean curiosity today is somehow artificial. It simply has better distribution. The same human impulse that once sent people down a whispered about path because a cousin mentioned it now sends them because a stranger online attached dramatic music to a creek crossing and called it cursed. The packaging changes. The appetite underneath remains the same, and part of that appetite is aesthetic. There is no getting around this. The Appalachians are beautiful in the exact way that supports fascination. They are old, wooded, layered, and visually suggestive without being too obvious. Mist in the hollows, light through hemlocks, blue ridges receding into distance, rhododendron tunnels, mossed stone, quiet water, old traces of human use half swallowed by forest. It is all very effective. A place can be difficult, dangerous, or unwise and still be deeply attractive. Beauty does not cancel risk. If anything, it often makes risk easier to underestimate. The pretty trail seems like it should also be the gentle trail. The mysterious trail seems like it should also be the meaningful trail. That equation is one of the mountain's oldest little tricks. Locals tend to be less vulnerable to it, not because they are immune to beauty, but because they have more context wrapped around it. They can admire a place and distrust it at the same time. In fact, that combination may be one of the most Appalachian forms of respect. Loving the mountains does not mean assuming they are there for your convenience. It means understanding that beauty and trouble often occupy the same patch of ground. Visitors, by contrast, sometimes arrive with an appetite for precisely that mix. They want the beautiful place with the bad reputation, because it feels more real than a pleasant, easy trail. There is a cultural hunger for this now, for places that seem untouched, difficult, half forbidden, or quietly hostile to superficial tourism. The avoided trail seems to offer authenticity. It suggests that the experience has not been fully flattened into signage and parking lots. It suggests that you might encounter a piece of the mountain still governed by older rules. That is very appealing. It is also partly true. Some of these trails do retain a kind of older difficulty, whether because they are poorly maintained, rooted in older land use, or simply passing through terrain that resists modernization. A person can absolutely feel that difference. The trail is not curated for ease. The woods are not organized around your convenience. You're not being escorted toward a predictable outcome. For many people, Especially those tired of highly managed experiences, this is exactly the draw. The place feels like a place, not a product. But authenticity has a way of charging for itself. The more real and unmanaged a route feels, the more responsibility it places on the walker. You have to read the trail, the weather, the light, your own energy, the time left, the return route, the creek, the footing, the possibility that the locals were not being quaint when they said they avoid that section. Curiosity can absolutely bring a person into useful contact with all of that. It can also encourage them to push one decision too far simply because they came to see for themselves and are not yet willing to accept that the answer may be, the place really is trouble. There is another reason people keep returning to warned about Appalachian trails, and it is quieter than thrill-seeking. Some are looking for scale, not physical scale alone, though the mountains certainly provide that, but emotional scale. Modern life is crowded with explanation, speed, and constant low-grade noise. A trail with a reputation offers something rarer: uncertainty, silence, depth, a sense that not everything has been translated into neat, accessible terms. For some people, that is deeply restorative. It reminds them that the world still contains places that are older than their schedules and less interested in performing clarity. Even the unease becomes part of the appeal. It makes the experience feel larger than entertainment. This helps explain why people who have had mildly unsettling experiences in the mountains often still go back. They do not always go back to the same trail, but they return to the region, to the woods, to the ridges, to the possibility of encountering something that does not flatten itself immediately into comfort. Fear and attraction are not opposites in these settings. They often travel together. A person may say a trail felt wrong and then spend months thinking about it with the peculiar fondness people reserve for places that genuinely got their attention. And the mountains are very good at getting attention. They do it through restraint. They do not explain. They do not conclude. They let a trail remain slightly unresolved in memory. A person returns home with mud on the boots, a few photographs, an uneasy story, and no clear verdict. Was the place dangerous or just demanding? Was the bad feeling justified or mostly weather and imagination? Were the local warnings practical, folkloric, or both? Did the trail deserve its reputation, or did the walker bring half the experience there in the mind? Because none of those questions get settled perfectly, curiosity survives the trip and often grows stronger afterward. That is why the mountains keep pulling people back. Not because every warning is false, and not because everyone secretly wants disaster, but because the combination of beauty, local caution, partial history, and unresolved experience is almost irresistible to the human mind. We are built to investigate patterns, to complete stories, to test boundaries, and to return to the places that made us feel something we could not immediately sort out. The Appalachian Mountains provide that in abundance. They offer trails that are scenic, difficult, old, strange, practical, and storied all at once. They offer places where a warning can mean several things at the same time. They offer enough explanation to keep curiosity moving and enough uncertainty to keep it alive. Even locals, for all their caution, are not entirely free of this pull. They may avoid certain routes, but they still talk about them. They still remember them. They still carry those places in conversation, in family stories, in rescue knowledge, in weather judgments, in a tone of voice that makes a simple trail name sound heavier than it ought to. And perhaps that is the clearest sign that these mountains have done what old mountains do best. They have made themselves impossible to reduce to one tidy answer. You can explain the footing, the fog, the fading paths, the weather, the rescue history, the old stories and the local warnings, and still there is something left over. Not magic, not necessarily, and not a mystery in the theatrical sense. More the simple fact that some places do not need to explain themselves fully in order to shape human behaviour. They only need to keep being themselves long enough for people to notice the pattern. The Appalachians have had a very long time to perfect that pattern, and by the time we reach the last stretch of this journey, The question is no longer only why people return, it is also why the mountains never seem particularly concerned with whether we understand them at all. And that may be the most useful place to end, because after all the trails, warnings, weather shifts, local stories, rescue patterns, and uneasy stretches of woods, the clearest truth about the Appalachian Mountains is also the simplest one. They do not need to explain themselves. That sounds obvious at first. Of course, mountains do not explain themselves. They are not in the habit of issuing statements, clarifying rumours, or gathering everyone together at a scenic overlook for a brief and helpful summary. Still, people keep wanting them to. We want the strange trail to resolve into one solid answer. We want the local warning to become either fully practical or fully superstitious. We want the bad feeling in the woods to turn out to be either excellent instinct or simple nerves. We want the avoided path to make sense in a neat, satisfying way. Yet the mountains remain what they are, and what they are is older, more layered, and less interested in neatness than we tend to be. That is not some mystical claim. It is just the reality of living land, long memory, and human habit all meeting in one region. A trail in the Appalachians can be dangerous because of weather, because of poor footing, because of fading tread, because of fog, because of steep descents, because of old side paths, because of social history, because of local caution, or because people keep arriving with the wrong expectations. Often it is several of those at once. A warning can be inherited, practical, emotional, and half-wrapped in folklore all at the same time. A place can feel wrong because the conditions are genuinely deteriorating, because the terrain is difficult to read, because the mind is filling in gaps, or because generations of local experience have attached seriousness to that patch of ground. Again, often it is several of those at once. This is what makes the mountains so difficult to flatten into one tidy category. They are not only scenic, they are not only dangerous, they are not only historical, they are not only mysterious. They are a working mixture of all those things, and they stay that way whether we manage to summarise them elegantly or not. People often struggle with that because modern life encourages clear conclusions. We like a clean answer, safe or unsafe, real or imagined, worth it or not worth it, overblown or justified. But land does not always cooperate with those categories. A trail can be manageable and still unwise. A local story can be embellished and still point to something true. A bad feeling can be partly psychological and still worth obeying. A route can be beautiful enough to attract people and difficult enough to punish them. The Appalachian Mountains do not force us to choose only one of these readings. They simply let all of them stand there together and wait for us to deal with it. Locals usually understand this better than visitors because they have had more time with the contradictions. They know a place can be lovely and troublesome. They know a trail can be fine in one season and foolish in another. They know a ridge can be enjoyable on a clear morning and miserable in changing weather. They know some warnings are based on very practical ground truth, and others have been shaped by years of retelling, but that both kinds of warning can still influence behaviour in useful ways. Most of all, they know the mountains have no particular obligation to simplify themselves for anyone arriving with a free weekend and a plan. That lack of obligation is worth sitting with for a moment. Much of modern travel is built around the idea that places should become legible quickly. There should be signs, maps, directions, ratings, tagged viewpoints, parking advice, and a reasonable expectation that the advertised experience will match the one on the ground. In many places that works well enough. In mountain country, especially in older, less polished corners of Appalachia, it works only up to a point. After that, the land starts insisting on its own terms. The route may be less obvious than promised. The conditions may change. The famous view may not be visible. The distance may feel longer than it looked on paper. The hidden gem may turn out to be hidden for perfectly sensible reasons, many of them involving mud, unstable footing, and disappointment. The mountain does not care that this feels inconvenient. It was there before the description, before the map app, before the online recommendations, and before the person who confidently said the trail was easy if you just watch your step which is one of those very funny phrases people use when they themselves are no longer responsible for what happens next. The land remains indifferent to all of that. It keeps its wet rocks, its narrow ridges, its fading turns, its steep hollows, and its changing weather. It does not update its personality to improve the visitor experience. That indifference is not cruelty, it is simply scale. The mountains are not participating in the same conversation humans are. We come to them full of plans, interpretations, and stories. We assign significance to certain trails, avoid others, attach warnings to some places and attraction to others. The land continues being itself. Water runs downhill. Fog settles where it settles. Ridges catch wind. Shade holds dampness. Old paths fade. Trees fall. Communities remember. Rescue teams learn patterns. New people arrive. None of this requires the mountain to become symbolic. It only requires the mountain to keep functioning, and that is partly why the region has such power over people. It reminds them that not everything exists to be immediately sorted into a simple meaning. A person can spend a day on one of these trails and come away with a mixed conclusion. The route was beautiful but unnerving. The warnings seemed exaggerated until they did not. The path was clear, except where it mattered most. The local stories sounded dramatic, except the place really did have a bad feel. The weather turned, but not in a spectacular way. The forest seemed peaceful, except for the long stretch where no one talked. Nothing dramatic happened, and still the whole experience stays in the mind longer than many more dramatic outings do. That staying power is important. It is one reason Appalachian trails with reputations continue to live in conversation. They resist quick closure. A person goes there looking for a clean verdict and returns with something less tidy. They understand more than they did before, but not enough to finish the matter. That incomplete understanding keeps the place alive in memory. It also keeps local warnings alive because they are not only about fact, they are about repeated contact with a landscape that does not always reveal the same face twice. One day, a trail feels like an overblown local legend. Another day, it feels exactly like the sort of place people were trying to warn you about. The difference may be weather, season, timing, company, or plain chance. Locals do not need that difference explained to them every time. They have seen enough to know that conditions matter, mood matters, and repeated outcomes matter. Outsiders often want a final answer. Mountain communities often settle for a more durable one. Respect the pattern. That may sound unsatisfying to anyone looking for a single grand conclusion, but it is actually the most solid answer this subject offers. Certain Appalachian trails are avoided because enough people, over enough years, have learned enough of the same lessons in enough of the same places to stop arguing with the result. The lessons are not always identical. Some concern footing, some concern weather, some concern route finding, some concern history, some concern the kind of strange, uneasy feeling that develops when a place becomes hard to read and gives too little reassurance back. But they gather in the same direction. A trail becomes known. A hollow gets a name in conversation. A ridge develops a reputation. People start leaving it alone, and once a place is left alone by the people who know it best, that absence becomes part of its identity too. Visitors often notice only the stories. Locals also notice the pattern of behaviour, who goes there and who does not. Which older residents never mention that route as an option. Which areas hunters know but recreational hikers avoid. Which trails remain quiet not because no one has heard of them, but because the people closest to them have already made their decision. Silence is information in mountain communities. The absence of recommendation can be as meaningful as a direct warning, sometimes more meaningful. People who live around these mountains do not usually waste much time performing caution for effect. If they consistently avoid something, there is usually a reason. That reason may not be fully transferable in words, and perhaps that is part of the point. Not every form of knowledge turns neatly into explanation. A person may know that a trail is bad news because they have seen how it behaves, how the weather gathers there, how the tread fades, how stories cluster around it, how people return from it looking less confident than when they started, or how rescue calls seem to emerge from the same stretch over and over. They may not be able to package all of that into one sentence that satisfies a stranger. So they do what mountain communities have always done. They shorten it. I wouldn't go there. Leave that alone. Not worth it. The sentence is brief because the experience behind it is long. There is a certain wisdom in brief warnings. They do not pretend to settle the whole mystery. They settle the practical decision. Go or do not go. Continue or turn back. Choose the easier trail. Get off the ridge. Leave the hollow alone after rain. Bring a light. Do not wander off the marked route because the old roadbed looks friendlier. The warning may not answer everything, but it answers the part most likely to matter before dark. And darkness, in the end, is one of the things that helps reveal what this whole subject is really about. Not literal darkness alone, though that plays its role, but the broader idea that some places remain partly unreadable, especially if we expect them to behave like simpler landscapes. The Appalachian Mountains are not unreadable in a mystical sense. People live there, work there, know them well, walk them constantly, and understand them in ways that outsiders often do not. But even that understanding is not total. Locals know many things. They do not know everything. They know enough to be cautious, enough to listen when the weather shifts, enough to hear an old story and not dismiss it too quickly, enough to respect a route without needing to conquer it. That may be the final distinction worth keeping. Respect is not the same as fear. Fear can be loud, dramatic, and fascinated with itself. Respect is quieter. Respect packs a light. Respect turns back on time. Respect takes local advice seriously, without requiring a complete defense of every old warning. Respect understands that some trails are not tests of character, and some views are not improved by a rescue team carrying someone back from them. Respect hears that a place has a bad reputation and responds, not with offended curiosity, but with the useful thought that there are many beautiful places in these mountains, and no shortage of ways to enjoy them without choosing the route everyone familiar with it has already stopped recommending. That sounds simple, and it is. Simple does not mean easy, though. Human beings are not naturally built to leave mysteries alone. We want to know. We want to see. We want to check for ourselves. The same qualities that make people thoughtful and curious also make them vulnerable to pushing too far in search of a clean answer. The mountains do not punish that every time. If they did, no one would keep making the mistake. They simply leave room for the mistake to matter. That is enough. And perhaps that is why local stories, rescue knowledge, weather wisdom, and plain old instinct all remain so tangled together in Appalachian life. None of them solves the mountains. All of them help people move through them a little more safely. A story keeps a child out of a dangerous hollow. A local warning keeps a visitor off a bad trail after rain. Rescue memory gives professionals a realistic view of what certain routes cost when things go wrong. Personal experience teaches somebody to trust the sudden sense that a place has stopped being generous. These are all different forms of learning, yet they point toward the same thing. The land does not owe you simplicity. That idea can be humbling, but it can also be comforting in its own way. It means the world is still larger than our categories. It means a mountain can remain partly itself rather than becoming fully translated into convenience. It means that local caution, inherited stories, and practical skill all still matter in a real material sense. There are places where people who know the land best continue to shape behaviour through memory and judgment, rather than through official signage alone. In a time when almost everything is constantly explained, reviewed, mapped, and ranked, that kind of knowledge feels unusual. It also feels worth protecting, because once every warning becomes content and every difficult trail becomes a challenge, something useful is lost. The old quiet way of speaking about certain places disappears. The difference between a caution and an invitation gets blurred. Places that needed restraint start attracting performance. The mountain still behaves as it always did. but the human relationship to it becomes noisier and less wise. That is not only unfortunate, it is dangerous. A hollow with a bad history does not become safer because someone made it fashionable. A ridge that catches weather does not soften because it has been photographed attractively at sunset. The mountains keep their own terms. They keep the steep ground, the bad footing, the fast weather, the fading paths, the long memory, the old traces, the uneasy silence, and the practical indifference that has shaped local respect for generations. They keep, too, the strange ability to remain beautiful while doing all of this. That may be the hardest combination for people to manage well. We are often prepared for danger that looks ugly and obvious. We are less prepared for danger that arrives in mist, green shade, soft light, and a trail that looks almost welcoming until it decides not to be. Even so, the real lesson here is not that the mountains are hostile. Hostility suggests intention. The Appalachians do not need intention to create caution. They only need to continue being old, wooded, changeable, and deeply themselves. The trouble comes when people mistake that for friendliness, or for a challenge designed personally for them, or for a mystery that must reveal itself if they just push a little farther. Very often it reveals nothing at all beyond the simple fact that the locals were right to be careful, and perhaps that is enough. Not enough for a dramatic ending, maybe. The mountains are not especially interested in providing one of those, but enough for an honest one. Enough to say that certain trails earn their reputation through repetition, that local warnings often carry more truth than outsiders realise, that beauty can sit comfortably beside risk, and that the Appalachian Mountains remain one of those places where practical knowledge, old story and direct experience still overlap in ways modern people do not always expect. In the end, then, the mountains do not need to explain themselves, because they have never depended on our understanding to remain what they are. The trails stay steep or slick or confusing. The hollows hold fog, the ridges catch weather. The stories continue in kitchens, on porches, in rescue vehicles, at trailheads, and in the dry, careful tone people use when they know a place well enough to stop arguing with it. The warnings remain brief. The land remains complicated. The sensible path is not always the most tempting one, but it is often the one that gets you home before the light goes. And that, in mountain country, has always counted for a great deal.